On a cold morning in April of 2017, Queen Elizabeth II walked into St. Margaret's Church at Westminster and took her seat near the front. She was 90 years old. She had buried her mother, her sister, and most of the people who had known her before she was a monarch. The service that morning was for a photographer. 600 people had come. Playwrights, musicians, old models, older aristocrats, a scattering of former lovers who nodded to each other across the pews with the careful politeness of people who had shared something they would rather not name. The man being remembered was Antony Armstrong-Jones, the Earl of Snowdon, and for 18 years he had been married to the Queen's only sister. The Queen sat through the tributes with the expression she had worn at 1,000 public events, which is to say, no expression that anyone could safely read. And that blankness is the whole story, if you know how to look at it, because the woman in that pew had spent more than half a century managing what this man had done to her family. She had watched him charm his way into the most photographed household on earth. She had given him a title, a palace apartment, and the benefit of every doubt. She had watched her sister come apart inside a marriage that London society discussed at dinner parties, the way other people discuss the weather. She had signed off on the first divorce to touch the inner royal family since Henry VIII was inventing new churches to get one. And then, for the next 4 decades, she had done something far stranger than banishing him. She had kept him close. He photographed her birthdays. He came to family funerals. He kept his office, his access, his place in the machinery. So the title of this video sounds wrong on its face, and it is worth saying so out loud before we go any further. The Queen never cut Antony Armstrong-Jones off. There was no exile, no cold shoulder that the cameras could catch, no seating chart humiliation of the kind her family had used on Wallace Simpson for 40 years. If you measure forgiveness by invitations, he was forgiven completely, but invitations were never how that woman kept score. The people who wrote the serious books about this family, the biographers who spent years with the courtiers and the ladies-in-waiting, and the men who carried the boxes, kept arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion. What Elizabeth extended to her former brother-in-law was accommodation. It looked identical to forgiveness from the outside. It was cheaper to maintain and it protected the institution, and it meant that the account was never actually settled. It was simply never mentioned. There is a version of never forgiving someone that involves shouting. Her family did not do that version. Hers involved perfect manners, forever. To understand what sat behind the Queen's face in that church, you have to understand what this man actually did. And the honest answer is stranger and darker than the usual story. The usual story says, a glamorous princess married a handsome commoner, and it did not work out. The fuller record, the one assembled by his own biographer with his cooperation, includes a child conceived with his best friend's wife in the weeks before he walked up the aisle of Westminster Abbey. A secret that held for 44 years until a DNA test quietly detonated it. It includes lists, actual written lists, titled Things I Hate About You, left between the pages of books where his wife would find them. It includes a note that 2 separate biographers report, 1 sentence long, that told a princess of the United Kingdom she looked like a Jewish manicurist and that he hated her. It includes affairs conducted in parallel on an almost industrial basis, before the wedding, during the marriage, through the second marriage, into his 60s, one of them ending with a woman dead by her own hand on a rooftop on New Year's Eve, another producing a son when he was 68 years old and still married to somebody else. It includes a public relations campaign after the separation so effective that the unfaithful husband walked away wearing the halo while his wife spent the rest of her life as the national cautionary tale. And here is the part that makes the story worth 2.5 hours of your time, rather than 10 minutes. He was also, by nearly every account, brilliant. He was one of the finest photographers his country ever produced. He designed an aviary so far ahead of its time that architects still write about it. He staged a medieval ceremony for television and made a 1,000-year-old monarchy look modern for one afternoon in 1969. He spent decades fighting for disabled people with a seriousness that shamed the able-bodied politicians around him. And he did it because he had dragged a polio-ruined leg through an English boyhood that taught him exactly what contempt felt like. The villain of this story spent half his life doing genuine good. The Queen knew both halves. That was precisely her problem. It is easy to close the door on a monster. It is very hard to close the door on a monster who makes you laugh, photographs your children beautifully, and serves your crown well. And so the door stayed open, and behind it, the ledger stayed unpaid. Before we go back to the beginning, if stories like this one are the reason you are here, do 2 quick things for us. Hit the like button, because it genuinely tells us this is the kind of history you want more of, and subscribe so the next one finds you. And while you are at it, drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. This channel has viewers on every continent that has electricity, and the comment section has become half the show. Now, back to a house in Belgravia, a long time before the pearls and the palaces, where a small boy is about to learn that the people who are supposed to love you can look straight through you instead. Because nobody becomes the man who leaves hate lists for his wife by accident. The cruelty had a workshop, and the workshop was his childhood. Antony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones was born on the 7th of March 1930 at Eaton Terrace in Belgravia, which sounds grand and partly was. His father Ronald was a Welsh barrister, clever and dry and not especially warm. His mother was Anne Messel, and Anne Messel explains most of what follows. She was a celebrated beauty from a family of celebrated aesthetes. Her brother Oliver Messel was the most famous stage designer in England, a man who could build a fantasy world out of plaster and gauze and make duchesses weep at the sight of it. The Messels lived for beauty, surface, presentation. It was the family business in every sense. And when Tony was 5 years old, his parents' marriage ended, and Anne moved on to bigger things at a speed that startled her friends. She married the Earl of Ross and became a countess with an Irish castle, and she proceeded to have 2 more sons, and the arithmetic of her affection was not subtle. The Rossi boys were the children of a countess. Tony was the leftover from the barrister. Guests at her gatherings later recalled her introducing the younger boys with delight, while Tony hovered at the edge of the room like staff. The detail that survivors of that world repeated for decades was the seating. At her table, her firstborn son was placed below the salt, down among the least important guests, in his own mother's house. Whether every such story is polished in the retelling hardly matters at this distance. The pattern was witnessed by enough people, over enough years, that his biographer treated the wound as the organizing fact of his life. Tony spent his childhood auditioning for his own mother and losing the part. A boy who learns at 5 that love is conditional on rank and beauty will spend the rest of his life doing one of 2 things. He will either flee that system entirely, or he will set out to beat it at its own game, to acquire more rank and make more beauty than anyone who ever snubbed him. Tony chose the second option with both hands. Then the body that was supposed to carry him through this campaign betrayed him. At 16, while at Eton, he contracted polio. This was 1946, before the vaccine, when the word alone emptied swimming pools. He spent months in a hospital in Liverpool, flat on his back, a teenager, alone, in a ward far from home. His mother, by the accounts that reached his biographer, visited him once during that entire confinement. Once. His sister Susan came, and the entertainer Noel Coward came, because Coward was kind and was passing through, and the countess who had produced him managed a single appearance. The disease left his right leg withered and shortened for life. It also left something else, something the people who knew him best pointed to whenever they tried to explain him. A private, bottomless fury at his own body, and a corresponding refusal to ever be pitied. He came out of that ward determined to move faster than everyone, dance longer, climb higher, seduce more, as if the leg were a debt collector he could outrun. Decades later, he would channel that fury into designing wheelchairs and fighting for access ramps, and it was the most honorable thing he ever did. But in the short term, it built a young man with a hole in the middle of him, a hole shaped like his mother's approval, and he would spend 40 years trying to fill it with applause and other people's spouses. Watch how fast he moved once he was upright again. At Cambridge, he was supposed to be studying architecture. He failed his exams and did not much care, because he had found the 2 levers that would lift him the rest of the way. The first was the river. In 1950, small and light and ferociously competitive, he coxed the Cambridge crew in the boat race, screaming a boat full of larger men down the Thames to victory. A cox is an interesting job for a boy like Tony. It is the position for someone who cannot match the others physically and so learns to command them anyway, steering from the smallest seat in the boat. Remember that image. It is the job he would hold, in one form or another, for the rest of his life. The second lever was a camera. Photography in 1950 was barely a profession for a gentleman. It was trade, something done by men with studios and price lists, and that is exactly why it was open. The grand professions had gatekeepers. This one had a door you could simply walk through if you had the eye, and Tony had the eye. He had grown up in the messel world of staged beauty, and it turned out that everything his mother's family had drilled into him about surfaces, light, arrangement, illusion, transferred directly onto film. By his middle 20s, he had a studio in Pimlico and a reputation that was climbing the walls of London society like ivy. His pictures did not look like anyone else's. The established court photographers of the era produced portraits that resembled paintings of furniture, stiff, retouched, embalmed. Tony shot people laughing, moving, caught between poses. He photographed actresses and debutantes and writers, and the fashionable world formed a queue, and the man at the top of the old order noticed. Cecil Beaton, the reigning royal photographer, all silk and acid, watched this limping young hustler take his market share and seethed about it in ways that leaked into diaries and dinner conversation. Beaton had spent a career making the royal family look like gods on clouds. This new boy made everyone look alive. And in 1956, the palace itself came calling. Tony was invited to photograph the Duke of Kent, and then, the following year, came the sitting that changed the temperature of his whole life. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, with Prince Charles and Princess Anne. The resulting pictures showed a monarch who appeared, for once, like a young mother who found her children funny, and the public loved them. And somewhere in the palace filing system, the name Armstrong-Jones acquired a small, approving tick. So set the stage, as 1958 opens. On one side of London, a 28-year-old photographer, with a wounded leg, a wounded childhood, a genius eye, a workshop full of secrets, and a proven ability to make powerful people trust him within minutes of meeting them. On the other side, a princess in freefall. Margaret was 27, and the most talked-about woman in the country, and her life had already broken once, in full public view. 3 years earlier, she had given up Peter Townsend, the divorced war hero she loved, after the government, the church, and the palace machine arranged matters so that keeping him would cost her everything, her income, her position, her country. She had made the dutiful choice and been rewarded with precisely nothing. Now she smoked through ivory holders, arrived at parties after midnight, left when she pleased, and wielded her rank like a riding crop on anyone who got too familiar. She was glamorous, wounded, bored, and dangerous, and the men her world kept offering her were dukes' sons with good manners and nothing behind the eyes. They met at a dinner party in Chelsea, given by Lady Elizabeth Cavendish, a mutual friend, who thought the princess might find the photographer amusing. That word again, amusing. It follows Tony through every account of these years like a spotlight. He did not bow and scrape, which she noticed. He did not flirt like a man on a campaign, which she also noticed. He talked to her as if she were an interesting woman rather than a national monument, teased her a little, made her laugh, and then, decisive above everything, did not chase. Of all the tactical instincts Tony ever displayed, and he displayed many, none served him better than understanding that Margaret had spent her entire life being pursued, and would only ever be caught by someone who appeared to be walking the other way. What followed was a courtship conducted like an intelligence operation. No photographers knew, almost no friends knew. The most watched woman in Britain was slipping across the river to a rented room in Rotherhithe, a single white room in a dockside terrace looking out at the Thames, where the sister of the Queen cooked eggs at a small stove, and nobody on earth knew where she was. You can see the appeal from both directions. For Margaret, the room was the first anonymous space she had ever occupied, a hole cut in the side of her gilded aquarium. For Tony, the situation was the messel dream taken to its logical conclusion. The boy seated below the salt now had the second lady of the land coming to him, on his territory, on his terms. Both of them were in love, by every serious account. It is just that they were partly in love with each other, and partly in love with what the other one represented, and neither of them could tell the difference yet. There would be time for that. 18 years of it. And then, in the autumn of 1959, a letter arrived that jolted the whole affair out of its pleasant secrecy. It came from Belgium, from Peter Townsend, and what it said pushed Margaret toward the fastest and most consequential decision of her life. If you want to understand everything that went wrong afterward, everything the Queen would spend decades declining to say out loud in churches, you have to start with that letter and with what Tony was doing in the very weeks he was preparing his vows. Because while the Abbey was being booked and the Empire was being charmed, the best man was being changed under a cover story, and in a manor house in Somerset, the wife of Tony's closest friend was newly pregnant, and the child was his. But before the letter can mean anything, you need the wound it landed on. So go back a decade, because the Margaret that Tony caught in 1958 was a woman already broken once, in the most public heartbreak of the century, and everything she did afterward, including marrying him, runs straight out of it. She had been the indulged one, always. Where Elizabeth was raised from age 10 as a future sovereign, drilled in constitutional history and self-suppression, Margaret was raised as the ornament, 4 years younger, prettier by the world's vote, funnier by everyone's, and licensed to be all the things her sister was forbidden to be. Their father, King George VI, adored her without disguise, laughed at her imitations, let her stay up, called Elizabeth his pride and Margaret his joy, and no one in that family ever pretended the division of labor was other than it was. One daughter got the crown. The other got the charm, and no instructions whatsoever about what to do with it. Then, in February of 1952, the king died in his sleep at 56, and both inheritances came due at once. Elizabeth, 25, returned from Kenya as queen. Margaret, 21, lost the one person whose delight in her had been the organizing fact of her life, and found herself, overnight, a supporting player in her sister's reign, with no script and a grief she was not permitted to perform. Into that grief stepped Group Captain Peter Townsend, and be precise about who he was, because the caricature does him wrong. He was not some passing flirtation, he was a Battle of Britain fighter ace, one of the genuine heroes of the war, who had served in her father's household for 8 years as an equerry, which means he had been part of the furniture of her adolescence. A calm, decent, melancholy man, 16 years her senior, whom the late king had trusted absolutely. He was also married, and then, by 1952, divorced, the innocent party in the language of the day, raising 2 sons. The comfort between the grieving daughter and the grieving courtier became love, and in 1953 he proposed and she accepted, and then came the moment the whole country would eventually see. At the coronation that June, outside the Abbey, waiting among the crowds and the cameras, Margaret brushed a piece of lint from Townsend's uniform, one small wifely gesture of ownership, and a reporter caught it, and the secret was over. What the machine then did to her is the necessary background to every choice she made for the rest of her life. The obstacle was never Townsend's character, which everyone conceded. The obstacle was the divorce. The Queen was supreme governor of the Church of England. The Church did not remarry the divorced, and the ghost at every meeting was the abdication, 16 years cold and still warm to the touch. The men who managed the crisis were the same men who had managed that one, and to them, Margaret was Edward all over again, private appetite against public duty. Tommy Lascelles, her sister's private secretary, when Townsend confided the engagement, answered with a sentence that has survived because Margaret repeated it with hatred for 50 years. You must be either mad or bad. Townsend was removed, posted to Brussels as air attaché with a speed that was barely decent, while Margaret was told the real terms. Under the Royal Marriages Act, she needed the sovereign's consent until she turned 25. After 25, she could marry without it, provided Parliament did not object, and there the trap closed, because the government of the day, stiff with churchmen, let it be known that a marriage would require her removal from the succession, the loss of her royal income, of her title's function, very possibly of her country, since remaining in England as a private scandal was thought unworkable. Her own sister, 27 years old and 2 years on the throne, was placed at the pivot of it, unwilling to forbid, unable to bless, asking only that Margaret wait. Margaret waited 2 years, and the country divided over her. The papers ran polls in which the public overwhelmingly took her side, and in October of 1955, 25 at last, she and Townsend spent 2 weeks meeting under siege, while the establishment ground its wheels, and then she gave in. The statement she issued, which she and Townsend drafted together, remains one of the saddest official documents of the century, announcing that, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, she had resolved not to marry him. She had chosen duty, exactly as her sister's world demanded, and here is the part that poisoned everything after. Duty never paid her back. There was no reward, no role, no compensation, not even, she came to feel, particular gratitude. The men who had broken it up went on to their clubs. Her sister went on being queen. Anthony Eden, the prime minister whose government had set the terms, was himself divorced and remarried, a detail Margaret never stopped pointing out with a hard little laugh. She had made the supreme institutional sacrifice and discovered that the institution simply banked it and moved on, and she drew the conclusion any intelligent, wounded person would draw, that goodness was a currency this world accepted but never redeemed. The Margaret of the ivory cigarette holder and the after-midnight arrivals, the Margaret who would one day reach for a photographer on the rebound from a letter, was assembled in the years directly after that statement, piece by piece, in full view of a family that had required the sacrifice and then looked away from the cost. And one more thread from this affair runs forward into our story, so mark it now. The sister at the pivot never forgot her own part. Elizabeth had loved Townsend too, in the way of a family, had wanted Margaret happy, and had allowed the machine to prevail, because allowing the machine to prevail was the whole of her constitution. The biographers who trace the sisters' bond agree that a residue of guilt over 1955 sat in the Queen for the rest of her life, and that residue purchased for Margaret a lifetime of indulgence no one else in the family ever received. The blind eye, the paid bills, the Sunday lunches through every scandal, which means the Queen's stake in the marriage of 1960 was never neutral. Tony was not just her sister's husband, he was the restitution, the happy ending that was supposed to close the account from 1955 and prove that Margaret's story could still come out right, and the Queen had signed for him personally against her own household's advice. Keep that in view, through everything you have heard, and everything still to come. When the marriage failed the way it failed, it did not merely hurt her sister. It defaulted on a debt the Queen had been trying to repay for 20 years, and it told her that the one great mercy she had ever tried to arrange inside her own family had been handed to a man who was hiding a pregnant mistress on the wedding day. People speak of the Queen's coldness toward emotional matters. Understand it here instead as scar tissue laid over scar tissue, 1955 under 1976. The same sister, the same island of a family, the same silence where other families would have screamed. The letter from Belgium said that Peter Townsend was getting married. His bride was a Belgian tobacco heiress named Marie-Luce Jamagne, and she was 19 years old, and if you look at photographs of her from that period, the resemblance to a young Princess Margaret is close enough to make you put the pictures down. Townsend and Margaret had, by her own later account, made a private pact after the renunciation that neither would marry anyone else. It was the kind of promise that lets two heartbroken people walk away from each other with something still intact. He broke it first. And he broke it, of all ways, with a teenaged copy of the woman he had given up. Margaret received the news in October of 1959, and within days, some accounts say within a day, she accepted Tony. Now, Margaret herself always pushed back on the tidy version of this. She pointed out, reasonably, that she married Tony months later, that the relationship had been serious for a year, that a grown woman may love twice. All true, but the sequence is the sequence. 6 years of carrying a torch, 1 letter, 1 proposal accepted at speed, and a lifetime of friends who privately believed she had reached for the nearest interesting man to prove she had not been left behind. Both things can be real at once. She loved Tony. She also needed, that particular October, to be someone's first choice, urgently, publicly, and forever. Marriages have been built on worse foundations. Not many have been built on more flammable ones. The engagement was announced from Clarence House on the 26th of February 1960, and the country made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a snort. A princess was marrying a photographer. Not a duke, not a European princeling, not even a guardsman. A man in trade, a man who worked for money, whose studio you could telephone and book. The press instantly christened him the Jones boy, which was not intended kindly. And inside the palace walls, the reaction among the old guard was several degrees colder than the public one. This was the world of the courtiers, the private secretaries, and equerries drawn from the same 40 families for generations, and to them Armstrong-Jones was an adventurer with a camera, a bohemian from Pimlico, with theatrical relatives and no regiment. One senior courtier's circle passed around the sour joke that at least the fellow would be able to take the christening pictures himself. The Duke of Edinburgh's attitude was said to be wary at best. The person who did not share the sourness, interestingly, was the Queen. She had met Tony, and Tony had done to her what Tony did to everyone in the first 20 minutes. He had made her laugh. He was quick and light and irreverent, in a way her world almost never permitted, and she was, by multiple accounts, rather taken with him. Hold on to that. The woman who supposedly never forgave him started out as close to an ally as he had in that building. There was also a colder institutional logic at work, and it is worth being honest about it. The palace had just spent the 1950s being pilloried for crushing Margaret's happiness over Townsend. A second veto was politically unthinkable. Whatever the old guard muttered into their sherry, the machine needed this wedding to happen, and needed to be seen smiling about it. So the machine smiled. The Queen gave her formal consent at a meeting of the Privy Council. The Abbey was booked, the 8th of May would be rehearsed, and the 6th of May performed, and the first royal wedding ever to be televised began rolling toward 300 million viewers. And underneath all that pageantry, in the private life of the groom, things were happening that would have stopped the ceremony dead had any one of them surfaced. Start with the best man. Tony's original choice was Jeremy Fry, his closest friend, a wealthy inventor from the chocolate family, charming, unconventional, and the owner of Widcombe Manor near Bath, where Tony spent half his weekends. Weeks before the wedding, Fry abruptly stepped down. The official line involved an inconvenient bout of jaundice. The actual reason, which the papers of the era knew and mostly sat on, was that Fry had a past conviction from 1952, a minor charge of the kind the era used against men who were caught with other men. In 1960, with homosexuality still criminal, that could not stand within a mile of a royal altar. A second candidate was reportedly considered and also fell away. The eventual best man, standing beside Tony in the Abbey, was Roger Gilliatt, a distinguished neurologist and the son of the Queen's own gynecologist, a man of blameless respectability whom Tony barely knew. Even his wedding party had to be art-directed. But the Fry story does not end with the best man switch, and here we arrive at the secret that sat under this marriage, like an unexploded bomb for 44 years. Jeremy Fry had a wife, Camilla. The Widcombe weekends were, by the account later given with the family's cooperation, considerably more complicated than country hospitality, and the complications ran in more than one direction. And in the weeks around the wedding, as Margaret was being fitted for a gown by Norman Hartnell, and the Abbey was filling with flowers, Camilla Fry was pregnant, and the father was the groom. Polly Fry was born 3 weeks after Tony and Margaret's wedding day, while the newlyweds were still on their honeymoon in the Caribbean. She was raised as Jeremy's daughter. She grew up calling another man father, and she was 45 years old before a DNA test in 2004 confirmed what parts of that circle had whispered for decades. Tony, for his part, first waved the story away, then stopped denying it. Margaret walked up that aisle before the largest audience in the history of weddings, not knowing that her husband's child was days from being born, to the wife of the man who was supposed to stand beside him. Sit with that for a moment, because it reframes everything that follows. The standard sympathetic account of this marriage says two mismatched people slowly destroyed each other, fault on both sides, 6 of 1. And fault there was on both sides, as we will see in brutal detail. But the marriage was not poisoned slowly. It was poisoned before it began. One of the two people at that altar was keeping a secret of a size that most marriages never survive even in ordinary houses, and he kept it with total composure, through the vows, through the balcony wave, through the honeymoon, through the christenings to come. Whatever else Tony Armstrong-Jones was, he was a man who could smile through a lie of that tonnage without a flicker. The Queen would eventually learn, along with the rest of the world, just how deep that talent went. The lesson would cost her family a great deal, and it arrived too late by 4.5 decades. The wedding itself, on the 6th of May 1960, was a triumph, which is exactly what it was designed to be. London was papered in flags. Margaret, tiny and luminous in white silk organza, wore the Baltimore tiara, bought for her at auction, a crown of her own that owed nothing to her sister's vaults. Tony was polished to a high shine. The Duke of Edinburgh walked the bride up the aisle, in place of her dead father, and cameras carried the whole spectacle into living rooms across the planet, and an estimated 300 million people watched a fairy tale that had been assembled, like one of Oliver Messel's stage sets, out of gauze and light, and things that were not what they appeared. Afterward, the couple sailed for the Caribbean aboard the royal yacht Britannia for 6 weeks, at a cost the papers worked out with relish. And in Parliament, a few Labour members grumbled about the bill, an early rumble of a fight about money and Margaret that would come back with teeth 20 years later. On the island of Mystique, a swampy, mosquito-loud speck that his friend Colin Tennant owned, the princess received a wedding present of land. Remember Mystique too. Almost nothing in this story appears only once. The island, the money quarrels, the watching cameras, the composed smile over the buried secret, every one of them comes back around, larger and sharper, like debts. They came home to a strange new problem that nobody in the palace had ever solved before. And to be fair, nobody has entirely solved since. What is a husband in that family actually for? Philip had wrestled the question and lost pieces of himself doing it. But Philip was royal-born, Navy-trained, and married to the sovereign, with an office and a role. Tony was a working professional at the top of his game, married to the sovereign's sister, with no role at all. The initial plan was that he would simply stop. Stop the studio, stop the commissions, become a decorative consort who opened things and stood behind his wife. Margaret seems to have genuinely expected this. What she got instead was an early and unpleasant discovery about the man she had married. Tony had not clawed his way up from the seat below the salt in order to retire at 30 into someone else's shadow. Within 2 years he had taken a position as artistic advisor to the brand new Sunday Times color magazine, a proper job with proper deadlines, and the arrangement scandalized the old guard all over again. A member of the royal family, going to an office, for a salary, at a newspaper of all things. The Queen's response was more interesting. In October of 1961, days before the birth of his first child, she created him Earl of Snowdon, a real earldom, taking its name from the great Welsh mountain, so that her sister's son would not be born plain Master Jones. The boy his mother had seated below the salt now outranked almost everyone who had ever condescended to him, including, at last, in the only arithmetic that had ever mattered to him, the Earl of Ross. His mother is said to have been delighted with him for the first time in his life. It had only taken a princess, an abbey, and an earldom. The courtship that letter detonated deserves its own scene before the engagement sweeps everything forward, because the 18 months Tony and Margaret spent hiding from the world is the part of this story where you can still see what they might have been, and its stage was a single rented room. The room was in Rotherhithe, on the south bank of the Thames, in what was then Hard Dockland, the absolute social opposite of Kensington. A small white chamber in a friend's house, with a window directly over the river, furnished with almost nothing, reachable only by arrangement. Tony had borrowed it from a journalist friend as a retreat, and through 1959 it became the couple's entire private world. Margaret would be driven over the bridge, incognito, headscarf and dark glasses, the princess third in line, vanishing into a district where no photographer would think to look for royalty, because no royalty had ever been there. And behind that door the whole apparatus of her life fell away. They cooked their own suppers, which she had essentially never done. He photographed her barefoot by the window with the tugs going past. They watched the river and got happily drunk on wine out of ordinary glasses and were, by the testimony of the tiny circle who knew, simply and unglamorously happy. Margaret talked about the Rotherhithe room for the rest of her life, the way other people talk about a lost country. Everything her rank had ever cost her, the watched days, the deferential rooms, the impossibility of ever being ordinary for 1 hour. The little room had refunded, and the man who held the key to it appeared to be the one person alive who could keep the refund coming. Understand what each of them was actually experiencing in that room, though, because they were not experiencing the same thing, and the difference is the whole marriage in miniature. For Margaret, Rotherhithe was reality at last, the true life underneath the performance, and she made the fatal assumption people in love always make, that the door led somewhere permanent. For Tony, the room was a set, a perfect one, dressed and lit by instinct, on which he was giving the performance of unperformed intimacy, the same gift he gave every sitter, scaled up to a life, and the proof of the difference is in the calendar you already know. The Rotherhithe idyll and the Fry entanglement ran concurrently. The man cooking suppers for a hiding princess was conducting the rest of his complicated life on the other side of the river, on the other days of the week, compartments sealed, books balanced, and the room's deepest privacy, it turns out, was not hers. It was his. Nobody, least of all the woman falling in love in it, knew more than the scene he had built for her. When the marriage later froze, and Margaret raged in ways her friends sometimes found disproportionate, the friends had usually never heard about Rotherhithe. She was not mourning a husband by then, or not only. She was mourning the room, the 1 hour of her life she had believed was real, and the discovery, delivered over 18 years in installments, that it had been furnished. While the abbey was being prepared, it is worth standing still for a moment in Tony's own world as it existed on the eve of the wedding, because the man walking toward that altar was carrying more than one concealed life, and the others matter to what came later. The Pimlico studio, and the parties around it, sat at the center of a London that the palace did not know existed, a demimonde of theatre people and designers and models where the rules of the suburbs did not apply and did not pretend to. Tony moved through it as a kind of prince already. His looks did half the work and his attention did the rest, because the gift that made his portraits great, the ability to make the person in front of him feel like the only person alive, worked exactly as well at parties as it did on film, and he spent it lavishly and on everyone. Men and women both fell for him, and the record on that is neither thin nor deniable. Decades later, the decorator Nicholas Haslam would write in his memoirs that he and Tony had been lovers in the 50s, and named another man besides, and the claims were met, tellingly, with a shrug rather than a lawsuit. Tony himself, asked about all this in old age, produced a sentence of such perfectly engineered ambiguity that it belongs in a museum of evasion. "I did not fall in love with boys," he said, "but a few men have been in love with me." Read it twice, and notice that it denies nothing, admits nothing, and flatters its own subject, all in 15 words. That was the man complete, in one line. None of which would matter to this story. His private life was his own, except for what it tells you about the scale of the double bookkeeping he brought into the royal family. In 1960, every strand of that life was criminal, scandalous, or fatal to a royal marriage, and he walked it all into Westminster Abbey, under a mourning coat, and kept the books balanced for decades. The best man had already been swapped once, to keep one such strand out of the photographs. The Fry household contained another. The point is not prurience, the point is competence. Most people who live double lives are eventually undone by strain, a slip, a letter, a witness. Tony ran a triple life at the most photographed address on earth, and was never once undone by accident. Every secret that ever surfaced about him surfaced decades later, through other people's books and other people's DNA, long after the damage windows had closed. The royal family has employed professional keepers of secrets for centuries. It had never before married one, and it has never quite grasped, then or since, that the charming amateurs are better at it than the professionals, because no one assigns them a file. There is one more piece of the pre-wedding picture, small, human, and easy to miss, and it concerns his father. Ronald Armstrong-Jones, the dry Welsh barrister, had watched his sons rise with more pride than the son ever fully registered, and at the wedding he was there, correct in his mourning dress, the least glamorous figure in the abbey, and the only member of Tony's family with no theatrical shine on him at all. He died 6 years later, in 1966, while the marriage was already curdling, and friends noticed that Tony, who performed every other emotion beautifully, went genuinely quiet about this one. The Welshness that Tony wore lightly all his life, The holidays at the family place near Caernarvon, the eventual choice of a Welsh grave, all of it traced back through the father, not the gorgeous Messel mother, whose approval he had chased through every drawing room in England. It is one of the standing ironies of his life that the parent he spent it impressing was the one who could not be impressed, while the parent who was proud of him all along got the leftovers, and if that pattern sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact pattern he would go on to impose on every woman who loved him. The devoted ones neglected, the withholding ones pursued. Psychologists have a phrase for people who convert their oldest wound into other people's oldest wound. The 18th century had a shorter one. As the twig is bent, so grows the tree. It is also worth pausing on the machine that would eventually decide how this marriage was remembered, because in 1960, the British press stood at the exact hinge between two eras, and the Snowdon marriage would live through the turn of that hinge and be destroyed by it. The world Margaret grew up in ran on a compact so complete that it is hard now to believe it existed. Editors knew things and did not print them. Everyone in Fleet Street had known about Edward and Mrs. Simpson for the better part of a year, while the British public read nothing, learning of the crisis days before the abdication itself. And that silence was not law, it was agreement, proprietors and palace and government all holding the same rope. Royal coverage meant engagements, gowns, and worship. The court correspondent was a species of diplomat, and the first crack in the compact had come, of all places, from the nursery. Marion Crawford, Crawfie, the governess who had raised Elizabeth and Margaret for 16 years with total devotion, published a memoir in 1950 called The Little Princesses, and by any later standard, the book is milk, affectionate, harmless, adoring. It did not matter. She had spoken, and the family cut her off absolutely. No reply to her letters ever again. No acknowledgement. 16 years of service converted overnight into non-existence. And when she died decades later, no flower and no word came from any of them. Every servant, every courtier, and every incoming spouse learned the lesson of Crawfie by heart. The family does not punish enemies half so hard as it punishes witnesses. But by the late 50s the compact was dying, and Margaret was the story it died on. She was young, beautiful, unhappy, and photogenic beyond any royal before her, and the new post-war tabloids discovered that she sold papers in numbers the Queen never touched. The Townsend siege had proven that royal private life could be covered like a serial, week after week, with polls and editorials and photographers in trees, and circulation had soared, and there was no walking that back. Through the 60s the deference thinned each year. Through the 70s it collapsed. By the time the News of the World bought its Mystique photograph, the transaction was not even controversial inside the trade. And standing behind all of it, from 1969, was the new proprietor of exactly that paper, and then of The Sun, an Australian named Rupert Murdoch, who regarded royal reverence as a market inefficiency and priced accordingly. Now place Tony inside that turning world, and notice what nobody at the palace fully grasped when they let him in. Every other member of the family experienced the press as weather, something that happened to you. Tony was the weather. He had been a Fleet Street man himself. His best friends were picture editors. He understood deadlines and picture desks and the exact value of an exclusive frame. And he was married into the family at the precise historical moment when that knowledge went from a curiosity to a weapon. For 18 years he was the only person inside the walls who knew how the new machine actually worked. And when the marriage came to its war, that asymmetry decided the war before it began. Margaret fought 1970s battles with 1930s rules, silence and dignity, the compact's rules, her mother's rules, and the compact was dead. Tony fought with the living rules, access and timing, and the well-placed lunch, and the outcome you already know. It bears saying plainly, because it is one of the strangest facts in the whole story. The royal family spent the 20th century losing ground to the press, and the one member who ever truly mastered the press used the mastery against another member of the royal family. The institution took note of that too. Institutions always do. The wedding day itself repays a closer look than the fairy tale summary allows, because even the triumph had its telling shadows, and several of them were visible at the time to anyone counting the empty chairs. Some of the grandest guests did not come. A number of Europe's royal houses sent regrets, and the pattern of the regrets was read at the time, correctly, as a verdict on the match, crowned heads declining to attend the marriage of a king's daughter to a photographer. The old aristocracy's private commentary was worse, preserved in the diaries and letters of the period, where the word one keeps meeting is unsuitable, and the confident predictions of disaster began before the confetti was swept. None of it touched the day's public success. The abbey was full regardless, the crowds were 10 deep, and the couple themselves were, by every account including hostile ones, radiant, which is its own small tragedy to read about now. The bride wore a gown of deliberate simplicity, Hartnell working for once without embroidery or pearls, 30 yards of silk organza cut plain, because both the bride and, tellingly, the groom had views about the pictures, and the groom's views prevailed, and the groom was right. The photographs of Margaret that day are among the most beautiful ever taken of any royal bride, and the man standing beside her in them had, in a sense, art-directed his own wedding, which everyone thought charming, and which was also the most complete statement imaginable of how he understood the event. It was an image to be managed. He managed it. Nothing in the frame betrays what you now know was outside it. The honeymoon ran 6 weeks through the Caribbean aboard Britannia, with a crew of over 200 serving 2 passengers, and the bill, when Parliament extracted it, ran to a figure that bought a great many council houses in 1960, and the grumbling in the Commons was a first taste of the money war to come. It was on that voyage that Colin Tennant delivered his wedding present, a plot of land on his island, Mustique, then an undeveloped scrub of a place with no electricity and heroic mosquitoes, a gift Tony declined to share in, and rather despised. One more small early fracture, since the island became Margaret's separate kingdom, precisely because her husband would not set foot in his own wife's wedding present. And back in England, in the 3rd week of the cruise, while the newlyweds sailed, Camilla Fry gave birth. The dates sit in the record for anyone to lay side by side, the wedding on the 6th of May, the birth before the month was out, the DNA result 44 years down the road. Every marriage begins with vows. This one began with a countdown already running, and the man who had started the clock stood on the deck of the royal yacht in the sunshine, photographing his bride, composing the picture, holding the light. For a few years, and this deserves saying plainly, the marriage worked, and worked in a way that made the whole country feel lighter. The early 60s were kind to them, and they were kind to the early 60s. They moved into Kensington Palace, into apartment 1A, which Tony gutted and rebuilt with the obsessive eye he brought to everything. 20 rooms, turned into a showpiece of pale walls and clean light, while the rest of the palace still smelled of the 19th century. He designed furniture for it. He engineered clever gadgets for it. Margaret, who had grown up in other people's grand houses, finally had a stage of her own, and the two of them threw the best parties in London on it. The guest lists tell you what had changed. Where royal entertaining had meant ambassadors and colonels, the Snowdon table mixed ballerinas with novelists, film stars with painters. Peter Sellers practically lived there. Rudolf Nureyev came. The Beatles crossed paths with them at premieres, and John Lennon, never one for deference, cracked afterward that they were priceless margarine and bony Armstrong, and even the mockery had affection in it. For the first time since the abdication, a corner of the royal family was fashionable. Not respected, not admired from a distance. Fashionable. The couple photographed at the ballet on a Tuesday were on the cover of magazines by Friday, and the 60s, which were about to sweep away so much of the old deference, treated the two of them as honorary members of the revolution. The children arrived in the middle of all this. David, Viscount Linley, in November of 1961, weeks after the earldom that ensured his rank. Sarah, in May of 1964. Tony photographed his own family the way he photographed everything, beautifully. And the pictures that survive from those years show something that all the later wreckage should not be allowed to erase. They show two parents who delighted in their children. Whatever Tony and Margaret became to each other, the people closest to the family repeated one thing for decades, that both of them were warmer and better as parents than as spouses, and the eventual proof of that would be the children themselves, who grew up steady, private, and on good terms with both, which, given what they lived through, borders on miraculous. And the third figure in the marriage, in these years, was the Queen. And the record of what she thought of Tony in the 60s is one of the most overlooked parts of this whole story. She liked him. The evidence sits in plain sight. She had approved the match against the muttering of her own household. She had given him an earldom within 18 months. When he wanted to keep working, an idea that horrified the courtiers, the palace let it stand, and the Sunday Times job went ahead. When he needed a public role, one was found, Constable of Caernarvon Castle, a title that sounds ornamental and was about to become anything but. Tony was easy with her, in a way almost nobody else on earth was permitted to be. He teased. He made the small dry jokes that her position starved her of. He took photographs of her that let her look like a person, and a woman whose face was on the money of a dozen countries did not take that gift lightly. Her own husband had spent a decade being sandpapered by the courtiers, and here was another outsider consort, another restless, clever, wounded man chafing inside the machine, and by several accounts Philip and Tony understood each other well enough in those early years, two prisoners comparing notes across the yard. The family that supposedly never forgave Antony Armstrong-Jones began by embracing him more generously than it had embraced almost any incomer of the century. That generosity is what gives the later ledger its weight. You cannot betray people who never trusted you, because trust him they did, and with the family silver. In 1965, London Zoo opened its new aviary, and the structure that rose over Regent's Park looked like nothing anyone had built before. A great angular tent of aluminium and mesh, held up by tension in a way that seemed to argue with gravity, birds wheeling through what appeared to be captured sky. Tony had designed it with the architect Cedric Price and the engineer Frank Newby, and the professionals were surprised to find that the Royal Amateur was no passenger on the project. The thing still stands. Architects still write about it. It was the first public proof that the eye behind the camera could work at any scale, and it set up the commission that became the high watermark of his royal service. In 1969, the Prince of Wales was to be invested at Caernarvon Castle, and the palace faced a problem it only half understood. The last investiture, in 1911, had been a Victorian costume pageant. This one would go out live on television to a country in the middle of the most irreverent decade of its century, and if it looked like men in fancy dress mumbling in a ruin, the monarchy would be laughed at in its own living rooms. The man handed the problem was the Constable of Caernarvon Castle, the photographer the courtiers had sneered at, and what Tony did with it, people who care about such things still study. He stripped the castle of Victorian clutter and let the medieval stone speak for itself. He designed a canopy of clear acrylic over the dais, transparent, so that the television cameras, which he positioned in his head before a single one was installed, could see the young prince from every angle, the crowning shot unblocked. He designed the thrones, slabs of Welsh slate. He designed his own uniform, a plain dark green zip-up affair, without medals, which the old guard thought looked like a bellhop and the cameras loved. 4,000 guests, 500 million viewers, and a 1,000-year-old institution appeared, for one afternoon, to belong to the modern world. It was, and there is no way around the irony, one of the great gifts anyone gave the House of Windsor in that century, and it was given by the man this video is about, 1 year before his marriage entered its terminal phase. The Queen saw exactly what he had done for her son and her crown. That is worth holding in your mind through everything that follows. When she weighed this man, and she had 4 decades to weigh him, Caernarvon sat on one side of the scale, and it never stopped sitting there. There was one more thing growing in him through those years that complicates every attempt to write him off, and it grew straight out of the ruined leg. Tony knew what it was to be stared at, patronized, and designed out of buildings. He had hidden his limp with tailored trousers and sheer will, but he had not forgotten it, and in the 60s he began turning that memory outward. He made a television documentary about the elderly and about disabled people that won awards and, more to the point, changed minds, because nobody in public life was pointing cameras at those lives at all. He worked on the design of a powered wheelchair platform, the Chairmobile, because it offended him, as an engineer, that wheelchair users were expected to be grateful for equipment designed with no eye and no dignity. In the next decade, a government would ask him to lead a working party on the integration of disabled people, and its report would land like a slap on a complacent establishment, and the fund he set up to help disabled students still hands out grants today under his name. None of this was image laundering. It ran too deep and too long for that. Decades of unglamorous committee rooms. And the people in that movement mourned him sincerely when he died. The same man wrote the hate lists. Both facts are true. If you want a comfortable story where the cruelty cancels the kindness, or the kindness excuses the cruelty, this is the wrong channel, and frankly the wrong family. The high 60s deserve one more look before the fall, because the scale of what the Snowdons were, at their peak, is the measure of how far there was to fall, and the peak is easy to forget, now that the wreckage is all anyone remembers. In 1965, the couple toured the United States, 3 weeks, coast to coast, and the country lost its mind over them. Crowds in Los Angeles and San Francisco, front pages every morning, a White House dinner where President Johnson toasted Margaret, and the band played till late, and the princess danced with the president, while Tony charmed the table, and the American papers, unburdened by British resentments, wrote them up as the most glamorous couple alive, royalty that looked like the movies. Hollywood turned out for them at a studio party where the guest list ran from Judy Garland to Grace Kelly's former colleagues, and Margaret, who had grown up worshipping the pictures, held court among the stars as the only person in the room who outranked stardom itself. It was the trip of her life. It was also, back home, a small scandal of its own, the cost of it questioned in Parliament, in what was becoming a tradition, but even the grumbling conceded the essential point, that no other members of the royal family could have done it at all. The Queen could carry a state visit. Only the Snowdons could carry America. At home, their apartment had become the crossroads of the new establishment, and the range of the traffic through it still surprises. On a given evening, the guests might include a cabinet minister, a ballet company, half the cast of a West End opening, and whichever visiting American star had asked. And they all asked. Tony's studio brought a second river of the famous through their lives, since everyone from statesmen to filmmakers wanted the Snowdon portrait, and Margaret collected the overflow. The friendships were real, not trophies. Peter Sellers was practically family, dining there weekly in the good years, worshipping Margaret, filming home movies with them that survive in archives, 60 seconds of grainy color in which a princess and the greatest comedian of the age perform sketches for an audience of each other. The choreography of it all ran on the couple's twin gifts, her rank and his eye, and for perhaps 6 or 7 years the combination produced something the monarchy had never had before and has never had since, an outpost inside the culture rather than above it. When people ask what the family lost when that marriage burned down, the honest answer includes this. It lost its embassy to the modern world. Everything the institution spent the next half-century clumsily seeking, relevance, glamour, the friendship of the arts, a way of being royal that did not require the country to kneel, that apartment had, casually, on a Tuesday, in 1965, and the two people who made it never made anything together again, except grief. The other man who watched Tony's arrival with professional interest was Prince Philip, and the comparison between the two consorts is worth a chapter of its own, because the family had exactly 2 case studies in the problem of the royal husband, and the differences between them explain a great deal about how each was finally judged. On paper they rhymed. Both were outsiders by the standards of the household. Philip, a penniless exiled princeling with sisters married into Germany, Tony, a working photographer with theatrical relations, and both had been opposed by the same courtiers, sneered at by the same old guard, and obliged to fight the same humiliating battles over precedence and purpose. Both were clever, restless, mechanical-minded men who found the pace of palace life somewhere between a sedative and an insult. Both modernized things, Philip the management of the estates and the televising of the family, Tony its entire visual presentation. And both, above all, married women they could never outrank, which for men of their generation and temperament was a daily swallowed stone. Philip spent the early 50s in open fury about it, denied even the right to give his children his surname, complaining that he was the only man in the country not allowed to do so, and the family histories agree that those years nearly broke him. But watch where the two roads divided, because everything is in the divergence. Philip's answer to the swallowed stone was to build. He carved out an empire of patronages and programs, threw himself into his award scheme for young people, into conservation, into industry, made himself the hardest working man in the operation, and stayed. Whatever went on inside that marriage across 73 years, and whole books have squinted at the question, the public record is one of total alliance. He walked one step behind her for 7 decades and made the step look like a choice. Tony's answer to the same stone was to keep a separate kingdom, the studio, where he was sovereign, and to make his wife pay rent, in humiliation, for the kingdom she kept. Philip converted his frustration into service to the institution. Tony converted his into punishment of a person. The institution, which cannot feel affection, but can measure contribution to the 10th decimal, measured both men over their lifetimes, and issued its verdicts in its own coinage. And it is no accident that Philip was mourned as the Rock of the Reign, while Tony was mourned as a brilliant man about whom certain things were better left unsaid. There is a coda to the comparison that the memoirs of the period preserve with some relish. The two men liked each other well enough at the start, 2 prisoners exchanging looks across the exercise yard, and Philip found Tony's company livelier than most of what the family offered. But Philip, whatever his own legend of gruffness and worse, had one iron rule that Tony never adopted. You do not embarrass the firm. Affairs might be rumoured of any man, tempers might flare, but the operation came first, always, and nothing with Philip's fingerprints ever landed on a front page aimed at the family's heart. When the Snowdon marriage began generating exactly such front pages, Philip's patience with his fellow outsider is reported to have run out early and completely, and his verdict, in the salty naval shorthand he reserved for such judgments, was not recorded by anyone brave enough to print it. The family's men closed ranks around Margaret in the 70s, to a degree that surprised her own friends, and it was not because they had grown sentimental. It was because Tony had broken the only rule the 2 consorts had ever actually shared. Now for the other ledger, because while the Avery was rising and the investiture was being planned, the marriage was already coming apart at the seams, and the seams had begun splitting almost indecently early. The people who knew them best dated the trouble to within a couple of years of the wedding, and the shape of the trouble was visible from the start to anyone who understood the 2 personalities involved. A friend of the couple put it in a sentence that Tony's biographer thought summed up the entire 18 years. They were both center-stage people, and only one person can occupy the center at any given moment. Margaret had been the most watched woman in Britain since she was a teenager. Tony had spent his whole life clawing toward the light from the seat below the salt. Neither had ever once, in their combined half-century of existence, yielded a room voluntarily, and now they shared a house, a diary, and a spotlight built for one. The rank problem made it worse in ways outsiders never saw. In public, Tony walked behind his wife. That is the deal, and he knew the deal. But Margaret carried the deal indoors. She was royal at the breakfast table. Guests noticed that even at their own parties, she could pull rank on him mid-conversation, the temperature dropping, the title suddenly present in the room, and Tony, who could not outrank her, had exactly one weapon that always worked, and it was the one he had been sharpening since childhood. He could withhold, he could go silent for days inside their own apartment, communicating through staff, present and unreachable, while Margaret, who could not bear solitude, who had married partly to escape it, circled him like someone locked out of her own house. His work gave the withholding a respectable cover. The Sunday Times sent him around the world for weeks on end, to Tokyo, to India, to New York, and the assignments were real, and they were also exits. She telephoned the studio constantly. The office developed procedures for the calls. A marriage between 2 people who each needed to be pursued had resolved itself into its only stable configuration, one of them chasing, the other one leaving, and the roles, once set, never again reversed. Then there were the affairs, and the plural is doing heavy work in that sentence. His came first in the record, and probably in fact, which the Fry business had already established as a pattern predating the vows. Through the 60s, the names accumulated in the gossip of their circle, models, assistants, the wives of friends, and in the early 70s came the one that ended the pretense, Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, a marquis's daughter, 20 years his junior, an involvement so poorly concealed that it reached the newspapers, which for a royal marriage in 1971 was the sound of a fire alarm. Margaret retaliated in kind, or consoled herself in kind, depending on whose memoir you trust. There was a reported entanglement with her daughter's godfather, a wine-grower cousin of the Queen's, and another with Peter Sellers, who was between marriages and half in love with her for years, and the discotheque world of swinging London supplied walk-on parts. The country suspected a little of this. Their friends knew most of it. The two of them knew all of it, and told each other, or let each other find out, because by now inflicting the knowledge had become part of the exchange. And it is here, in the early 70s, that the marriage produced the artifacts it will always be remembered by, the ones that moved it out of the ordinary catalogue of unhappy famous couples into somewhere genuinely dark. Tony began leaving notes. Not angry letters after a row, which any marriage might generate, but small compositions, planted where she would find them in the course of an ordinary day, in a desk drawer, in her glove, tucked between the pages of the book on her nightstand. One, which her biographer Sarah Bradford reported and his biographer Anne de Courcy confirmed, was a list with a heading, 24 Reasons Why I Hate You. Another was a single sentence, and because two serious biographers stand behind it, it can be repeated here as reported. You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you. Read that again, and notice everything packed into it, the class sneer, the casual anti-Semitism of his era, and set deployed as a weapon, the plain declaration at the end. This was not a man losing his temper. A man losing his temper shouts and regrets it. This was a man with the finest visual and verbal precision of his generation, sitting down, choosing words, and placing them where his wife would find them alone. The staff at Kensington Palace, whose accounts fed every serious book about the couple, described the atmosphere of those years in the language people usually reserve for haunted houses. Shouting that carried through walls, silences that lasted longer than the shouting, Margaret drinking earlier in the day, her famous grouse, and the vodka before lunch, and Tony arriving home at 3 in the morning, smelling of other rooms, and the two children growing up in the crossfire, with the household staff forming a kind of human screen around them. Fairness requires the other column, so here is the other column. Margaret gave as good as she got in every currency she held. She could freeze him in front of guests with a single sentence about trade. She once reportedly answered his complaint about her behavior toward his mother, with the observation that she had always been perfectly polite to the Countess, delivered in a tone that made the politeness the insult. She mocked his friends, kept him waiting, spent money in a way that made his earnings look like pocket change, and made sure he knew it. Guests at Kensington Palace in the terminal years described dinner parties conducted as duels, each spouse recruiting the table against the other. Wit used the way their class had always used it, as a stiletto with a smile on the handle. Anne de Courcy, who had access to both camps, refused in the end to appoint a single villain, and her summary deserves quoting in spirit, if not verbatim, that two people deeply in love, each accustomed since childhood to getting their own way, and to making life extraordinarily unpleasant for anyone who blocked them, had discovered in each other the one person who would not move. The difference, and it is the difference this whole story turns on, is what each of them did with their cruelty. Hers was hot, spoken, witnessed and over. His was cold, written, planned and permanent. Hers humiliated him at dinner. His was designed to make her doubt her worth when no one was watching. Ask anyone who has lived inside both kinds which one leaves marks. By 1973, the two of them were leading almost fully separate lives inside the same address, and the stage was set for the arrival of the young man who would take all the blame for a collapse that was already complete. In September of that year, at a house party in Scotland arranged by Colin Tennant, Margaret was introduced to a young gardener named Roddy Llewellyn. He was 25, she was 43. He was gentle, unfamous, slightly lost, decorative, and kind to her, and she took him up with the relief of a woman who had spent 13 years being fenced with and had finally met someone who simply liked her. Whatever the tabloids made of it, and they made everything of it, the people around Margaret mostly described Roddy as the least complicated affection of her adult life. He asked her for nothing. He was frightened of the palace and said so. She paid for things and mothered him and flew him to the island she had been given as a wedding present, and it was there, on Mustique, that this private consolation collided with the industry that had been waiting years for exactly such a picture. A photograph is coming that will end the marriage, and a war is coming after the photograph. But two people lived at the center of that house through all of it who have barely been mentioned, and before the ending starts, they need their chapter. And in the middle of the gathering storm stood two children, and because they are so often reduced to a sentence in accounts of this marriage, give them their chapter here, both because they deserve it, and because their story carries a piece of evidence about their father that has to be weighed with all the rest. David and Sarah grew up at Kensington Palace in the Crossfire years, and the household accounts do not soften what that meant. The raised voices through the walls, the long freezes, the parents' separate staircases of guests. What the accounts also agree on, with a unanimity that is almost jarring against everything else you have heard, is that both parents shielded the children with real success, and that Tony in particular was, in the plain words of people who watched, a wonderful father. He built things with them, took them to the studio, taught them tools and cameras, treated their opinions as interesting, and neither child has ever, in half a century of opportunities, said one public word against him. When the separation came, the arrangements were made with a civility the couple could manage for no one but them, and the children moved between the households and were visibly loved in both. David grew up to work with his hands, exactly as his father had, founding a furniture workshop whose pieces now sell for serious money, a career choice that reads as one long, quiet tribute. Sarah became a painter, married an actor turned artist, and constructed the most private and least scandalous life of anyone born into that family in a century. And Sarah is where the story loops back to the Queen in one of its gentler ironies. The niece grew up to become, by the settled consensus of everyone who observed the family's inner weather, the Queen's favorite, full stop, the relative in whose company the sovereign was most often described as natural, easy, and glad. The two lunched, holidayed, rode together for decades. Think about the geometry of that. The daughter of the marriage that had cost the Queen so much became one of the consolations of her old age, and every hour she spent with Sarah was an hour spent with a face that carried Tony in it, his fine bones, his eye, since Sarah's talent is visual like his, and there is no arranging of that geometry in which the Queen's feelings about the father could ever be allowed simple expression. Cut off the man, and you cut through the children, through Margaret's children, through the last living pieces of Margaret. Whatever accommodation the Queen maintained with Tony, part of its price was paid on behalf of David and Sarah, and part of its explanation stands in every photograph of the Queen laughing beside her niece. Families that cannot afford honesty pay in courtesy, and the installments never end. One more measure of the children's meaning, and then the storm. Alone of everyone in this story, David and Sarah managed to be loved without reservation by both of their parents, and by the Queen, and by the Queen Mother, across every front of a Cold War that lasted 40 years, which suggests a certain genius of navigation in them both, learned young, the way children of such houses always learn it. At Tony's memorial they sat near the Queen. At Margaret's funeral, 15 years earlier, they had flanked their father. Whoever else failed whom in this story, the children failed no one. And if you want the single best argument that Antony Armstrong-Jones was more than the sum of his cruelties, it is not the aviary, and it is not the investiture. It is that these two particular people, who knew him longest and closest, and had the most cause of anyone alive to render the harsh verdict, loved him plainly to the end. Now, to a beach on Mystique, and the photograph that ended everything. But the photograph needs its context, because the 2 years before were their own kind of siege. From 1974 onward, the Llewellyn affair was an open secret in Fleet Street, held back by the last crumbling conventions of royal coverage, and Tony used those years with a strategist's patience. This is the phase of the story where his particular genius, the management of appearances, turns fully toward his own exit. He had grounds of his own to fear exposure. His affairs were older, longer, and more numerous than hers. But he understood something Margaret never did. Something he had understood since the messel drawing rooms of his childhood. The public does not weigh evidence. The public reads pictures. And so, while his wife flew to a Caribbean island with a young man, Tony arranged to be photographed working in the studio, graying and dignified, escorting his children to school, attending charity functions for disabled people, which had the advantage of being both genuine and useful. Friends of Margaret complained for the rest of their lives that in these years Tony ran a quiet press operation on his own behalf, lunching editors, charming the photographers who had once been his colleagues, positioning himself frame by frame as the wronged professional holding a family together, while his wife sunned herself with a boy half her age. Whether it was a campaign or just an instinct hardly matters. It worked either way, and it worked completely. The detonation came in February of 1976. The News of the World published a photograph taken on Mystique, Margaret and Roddy, at a beach table, both in swimsuits. By the standards of what tabloids would later do to this family, the picture was almost chaste. There were other people at that table, cropped out. It did not matter. A princess, a swimsuit, a garden boy 17 years younger, a private island paid for by, the papers implied with varying honesty, the public purse. The picture said everything the country was already primed to believe about her. The idleness, the luxury, the appetite. And it said it in one image on a Sunday morning, in a Britain sliding into economic misery, where inflation was eating wages, and the unions were at war with the government, and a sybaritic royal on a beach was the last thing anyone had patience for. Within weeks the palace announced it. Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, and the Earl of Snowdon have mutually agreed to live apart. The first formal separation at the heart of the royal family in living memory, and everyone understood it was the anteroom of something the family had not permitted since the 16th century. Now watch what each of them did with the moment, because the contrast decided how each would be remembered, and it remains one of the most lopsided public relations outcomes in royal history. Margaret did nothing. Her code, her mother's code, the code that had destroyed her once already over Townsend, said you do not explain, you do not complain, and she followed it into the propeller. She made no statement beyond the official one, and absorbed a hurricane of press moralizing, members of parliament rising to call her a parasite and demand her removal from the civil list, one Labour member suggesting she be struck off entirely, columnists conducting a national audit of her worth and finding her wanting. And Tony, who happened to be in Sydney when the separation was announced, walked out to the airport cameras and delivered a short statement of such perfect pitch that it deserves study. He was desperately sad, he said, for the children above all. He asked for understanding for his wife. He thanked the press, thanked them for their courtesy. He wished her well. Then he flew home looking like grief in a good suit. It was flawless. It was also, given the 2 decades of conduct you have just heard catalogued, one of the most audacious performances ever given in an airport, and it sealed the public verdict for the next 50 years. Ask a Briton of that generation what went wrong between those two, and the answer, still, is Roddy on the beach. The hate lists were not published. The Fry paternity was a quarter century from surfacing. The affairs had been managed. One spouse had been photographed in a swimsuit, and so one spouse took the fall, and the other one collected condolences, and somewhere in the palace, reading her press cuttings, sat a queen who knew a great deal more than the newspapers did, and could say none of it. The divorce followed in 1978, and here we reach the institutional heart of this story, the part that explains why the Queen's relationship to this man could never again be a purely private matter. The petition went through in the spring, undefended, on the tidy grounds of 2 years' separation, and the decree came in July. Measure what that sentence cost. No one that close to the throne had legally dissolved a marriage since Henry VIII, whose approach to the problem had involved a new national church and the occasional beheading. For 400 years the family had held the line, and the line was the whole point. The monarch was supreme governor of a church that barely tolerated remarriage. 22 years earlier, this very family had told this very woman that she could not marry a blameless war hero because he had a divorce in his past, had let her be broken on that wheel in front of the world, in defense of the principle that the royal family did not touch divorce. Edward VIII had lost a throne over it. Townsend had been exiled to Brussels over it. And now the principle fell anyway, in Margaret's own life, over a marriage to the man the family had welcomed, precisely because he was supposed to be the happy ending. Every sacrifice the institution had extracted from her, from Townsend, from itself, was retroactively rendered pointless by the collapse of the marriage it had approved. The Queen, whose consent had launched it and whose reign now absorbed the precedent, is recorded by the biographers of the period as regarding the whole business with a sadness she did not perform for anyone. Her private secretary's generation used a phrase for what the divorce did to the family's defenses. The dam had a hole in it now. Within 15 years, 3 of her own 4 children would pour through that hole, and the annus horribilis of 1992, the year of separations and fire, was made structurally possible in July of 1978. She knew it too. Of all the people in the kingdom, the woman whose entire life was the maintenance of that dam understood best what had just been breached, and in the middle of the breach, composed, well-dressed, and lethally sympathetic, stood her former brother-in-law, thanking the press for their courtesy. And then Tony did the thing that, by several accounts, moved matters between him and the family from sorrow into something colder. 5 months after the decree, in December of 1978, he remarried. His bride was Lucy Lindsay Hogg, a film researcher he had met on a documentary shoot, gentle, discreet, and pregnant. The wedding was at a register office. Their daughter Frances arrived the following July. Do the arithmetic the way everyone in the palace did it that Christmas. The tireless wronged father of the airport statement, the man who had spent 2 years being photographed as the abandoned party, had a new wife carrying his child before the ink on the decree had seen a full season. Margaret, for all her sins, never remarried, never even came close, and spent the following decades as the national exhibit of ruined royal womanhood, while the man who had left lists of hatred in her books walked into a second marriage, a new baby, and an unbroken stream of royal commissions. If you are looking for the moment the Queen's account with Antony Armstrong-Jones stopped being reconcilable, the sources will not give you a scene, because this family does not stage scenes. But more than one chronicler of these years points to that December and invites you to notice the shape of the silence. The 2 years between the separation and the divorce deserve a closer accounting than the summary they usually receive, because the decision to cross the 400-year line was not taken in a day, and the record of how it was taken answers one of the standing questions about the Queen, namely, whether she could have stopped it, and whether she tried. The separation of 1976 was designed, like everything this family designs, as a terminus rather than a way station. Living apart was survivable precedent. Married in law, separated in fact, the arrangement could in theory have run for decades, and there were voices in the church and the household arguing that it should, that the line itself mattered more than the comfort of the parties, which was, after all, exactly the doctrine that had been enforced on Margaret in 1955 at the price of her happiness. What moved matters to the final step, and the biographers are in broad agreement here, was Margaret herself. By early 1978, she wanted the marriage legally dead, not, as the gossip assumed, in order to marry Roddy, a step she seems never to have seriously considered, and he never sought, but for reasons that were almost administrative in their sadness. The half-state was intolerable to her, the fiction of a marriage with a man she now communicated with through lawyers, and there was a bleaker motive underneath, reported by her circle, that she wished to free Tony to marry again, since it had become obvious to everyone that his life had already rebuilt itself around Lucy, and Margaret, whatever her sins, had concluded that the honest ending was better than the respectable one. Read that motive twice, because it does not fit the national caricature of her, and it happened anyway. The party who forced the clean ending, at real cost to her own standing, was the woman the country had already convicted of selfishness, acting so that the man who had left hate lists in her books could remarry in peace. The Queen's part in the deliberations is preserved only in outline, which is itself informative, since this family leaves outlines where it wishes to leave nothing. Her consent was constitutionally unnecessary for a divorce, unlike a marriage. But nothing of this magnitude proceeded without her, and the accounts agree on her posture, deep reluctance, no veto. She is reported to have satisfied herself on 2 points before letting the machinery run: that reconciliation was truly impossible, and that the children's arrangements were settled and humane, and then to have stood aside and absorbed the institutional cost in silence. The Archbishop of Canterbury of the day was consulted, and, in a sign of how far the world had turned since 1955, raised no public objection, and when the decree was announced in May of 1978, the sky, as the palace had feared and half hoped, did not fall. The newspapers, which had flogged the separation for 2 years, treated the divorce itself almost gently, a formality acknowledging the obvious. The public, polled, largely shrugged. The line that 3 generations had been sacrificed to hold turned out, when finally crossed, to be defended by nobody, and there is a particular institutional bitterness in that discovery, which anyone who has ever enforced a dying rule will recognize. Margaret had lost Townsend to a principal. 23 years later, the principal was retired, without a shot fired, and the woman it had cost the most stood in the middle of its retirement, legally free, publicly blamed, and privately, by the account of everyone near her, relieved beyond words, and sadder than she had ever been. One detail from those 2 years has outlived the rest, and it belongs here because it shows the 2 principals as they truly were at the end, stripped of the war. In the worst of it, with the lawyers engaged and the press at every door, Tony and Margaret found themselves obliged to attend the same christening, and the guests braced, and instead the 2 of them fell into conversation in a corner, and were seen, to general astonishment, laughing. Really laughing, the way people laugh who once had a private world. Observers of the family produced a dozen such moments over the following decades, at the children's weddings, at previews of his exhibitions, which she attended, at parties where they gravitated together, and were, witnesses insisted, the 2 most amused people in the room. They had been catastrophic as husband and wife, and remained, to the end of her life, strangely successful as something else, veterans perhaps, of a war only they had been in. Sarah Bradford records that in Margaret's last years, Tony telephoned her constantly, and visited, wheeled in latterly, an old man calling on an old woman, both of them ruined in different ways by the thing they had made together, neither of them ever once explaining it to anybody else. When people ask how the Queen could bear to keep Tony inside the family after everything, part of the answer, the part this chapter exists to record, is uncomfortable but true. Margaret kept him first. The Roddy years also contained a darker passage than the beach photograph, one that the family knew about and the public did not, and it belongs in the record because it shows what condition Margaret had actually been reduced to while the newspapers were drawing her as a sybarite. In the winter of 1974, with the marriage in its terminal freeze, and Roddy himself wobbling under the pressure of an affair he was too young and too fragile to carry, Margaret reached a bottom that frightened everyone around her. Roddy had fled abroad for a spell, overwhelmed. Margaret, alone at Kensington Palace, in a marriage that now communicated through slammed doors and staff, took more sleeping pills than she should have. Her biographers, treating the episode with care, record her own later insistence that she had wanted only to sleep, that the exhaustion was so total that oblivion for a night was all she sought, and record equally that the people around her at the time did not experience it as an ordinary early night. She was watched afterward, her mother was told, her sister was told, and the family's response, in its way, says everything about its emotional machinery. No intervention, no confrontation with Tony, no changes at all that anyone could see, just a closer watch, a tighter circle, and silence. The institution did not have a procedure for a princess in despair. It had a procedure for containing news of a princess in despair, and that procedure worked flawlessly, and the country moralizing about her tan lines 2 years later knew nothing of the winter of 1974. The Queen knew. Hold that beside the airport statement in Sydney. The desperate sadness, the thanks to the press for their courtesy. Whatever the public weighed in 1976, the sovereign was weighing a different file, and hers included the sleeping pills. It is also worth recording what became of Roddy himself, because his exit is a small window into what Margaret was like when she was not defending herself. The affair wound down at the end of the 70s as he grew up, and out of it, and in 1981, he told her he had fallen in love with a woman his own age, and meant to marry. Margaret's circle braced for the storm. There was no storm. She gave the couple her blessing, attended their wedding celebrations, stayed on warm terms with them both for the rest of her life, and was godmother, in affection if not in formality, to the family that followed. The man who had cost her more than anyone since Townsend walked away whole, unresented, even loved, because he had been honest with her, and honesty was the one currency that always bought Margaret's mercy. She had spent 18 years married to its opposite. Her friends thought the gentleness of the ending with Roddy was the saddest evidence in the whole story, proof of the wife she might have been for a husband who had simply told her the truth. Mystique itself deserves a final word, because the island runs through this story like a second home that became a second wound, and its ironies are almost too neat for fiction. The wedding present plot sat undeveloped for years, but after the marriage began to fail, Margaret built on it, and the house she built, Les Jolies Eaux, the only property she ever owned outright in her life, was designed for her by Oliver Messel, the celebrated theatrical designer who had retired to the Caribbean, and who was, of course, Tony's uncle, the very man whose glamour had lit the drawing rooms of Tony's childhood and defined the world that ranked the boy below the salt. The symmetry needs no forcing. The refuge Margaret built from her marriage was designed by her husband's family, in her husband's family's style, stagecraft and beauty and artifice, so that even her escape from the Armstrong-Jones world was an Armstrong-Jones production. She loved the house beyond anything else she possessed. On that island she was not third in line to anything. She was the founding celebrity of a private world Colin Tennant had built around her, swimming in the mornings, presiding at picnics, surrounded by people who had come precisely because she was there, and the photographs from Mystique in the good years show a woman you meet nowhere else in her archive, brown, laughing, unwatched, or so she believed, until 1976 taught her that the island's privacy had a market price like everything else. And the house had one more lesson to teach, saved for the end of her life. In the late 90s, needing to settle her affairs and provide for her children in the face of taxes she knew her estate could not dodge, Margaret transferred Les Jolies Eaux to her son, and David, a businessman before he was a sentimentalist, in time, put the house up for sale, and the sale went through while his mother was still alive. Friends described her as deeply wounded by it, careful as she was never to blame him publicly, and her final visits to the island were made, in effect, to somebody else's property, wheeled by then, dimmed by the strokes that the island's own bathroom had helped inflict. The one place on earth that had ever been wholly hers ended as a rental in her last summers. There is no villain in that ending, only arithmetic, but as a closing image for the whole seam of this story, that began with a wedding gift on a honeymoon deck, it is hard to better. Everything Margaret was ever given came with terms attached that revealed themselves decades later: the marriage, the island, the freedom of 1978, and the man who had stood beside her when the island was handed over, declining his half of it, kept, as usual, the only thing that never depreciated. He kept the pictures. The divorce also has a financial chapter, and it should not be skipped, because money is where the public's fury actually lived, and money is where the Queen's institutional problem with this whole affair became concrete enough to count in pounds. Margaret's income came from the civil list, the annual parliamentary grant that funded the working royal family, and through the 70s, her allowance ran to tens of thousands a year, at a time when the average British wage was a small fraction of it, and every penny of it was voted, publicly, by a parliament full of members, representing towns where the lights were going out. The 70s were the decade of the 3-day week, of inflation above 20%, of rubbish in the streets and the dead unburied in the strikes to come, and into that country the newspapers dropped, at regular intervals, accounts of a princess wintering on a private Caribbean island. The Member of Parliament who made a career of the subject was a Scottish socialist named Willie Hamilton, who attacked the monarchy's finances for decades with a relish that made him famous, and Margaret was his gift that never stopped giving. He called her, on the record, an expensive kept woman, and worse, and where attacks on the Queen never landed with the public, attacks on Margaret landed every time, because the public had already privately convicted her. After the Mystique photograph, the question moved from the fringes to the centre. Editorials asked in plain terms what the country received for Princess Margaret's allowance. Her engagements were counted and found fewer than her critics demanded. There were calls, seriously reported, for her removal from the civil list altogether, and the palace, which had weathered republicanism before, found itself defending the indefensible position that the public must fund a separated princess's household while her private life filled the Sunday papers. Now look at the same ledger from inside the palace, because this is the part that landed on the Queen's desk, rather than in the newspapers. Every crisis of the reign was managed against one background question: What does this cost the institution? And the Snowdon divorce was expensive, in the only currencies the institution recognizes. It spent public goodwill at the worst moment of the century to spend it, with the country in economic misery, and the Jubilee of 1977, the great restorative pageant of the reign, sitting directly in the blast zone, its planning conducted in the same months as the separation coverage. It spent parliamentary capital, handing the monarchy's enemies their best material in a generation. And it spent precedent, the most expensive currency of all, as we have seen. Tony's own finances, by contrast, came through the wreck in astonishing shape, and people noticed that too. He had never taken public money in his own right, which was to his credit, and became part of his armor, the working man who paid his way, and the settlement left him with his earnings, his title, and a house besides, since the accounts of the settlement that reached the biographers say the funds for his new country property came from Margaret's side of the ledger, which means the departing husband left the marriage materially assisted by the family his departure had damaged. Nobody involved ever explained the arrangement, because nobody involved ever explained anything, but as a summary of the entire relationship between Antony Armstrong-Jones and the House of Windsor, it has never been bettered. He cost them a fortune, and they helped him move out. If you have made it this far, you are the kind of viewer this channel is built for. So pause for 10 seconds and do the two things that keep these documentaries coming. Make sure the subscribe button below has been pressed, and tap the bell beside it, so the next release actually reaches you, because the algorithm shows these long histories to almost nobody, unless you tell it to. And if this story has already told you something you did not know, put it in the comments, because we read them, and the sharpest corrections and additions in this series have come from you. Now, to the question this whole video is named for. So now we can put the question of this video on the table properly, with the evidence where we can see it. What did the Queen actually do about this man, and what did it mean? And the honest place to start is with everything she did not do, because the list is astonishing when you assemble it in one place. She did not strip him of anything. The earldom stayed, the style stayed, his seat in the House of Lords stayed, and when the hereditary peers were finally cleared out of that chamber in 1999, Tony was handed a life peerage so that he, almost alone of his kind, could remain, a courtesy widely read at the time as the family's doing, or at least done with the family's blessing. She did not close the palace doors. He appeared at family weddings, family funerals, jubilees, the christenings of children born a generation after his divorce. She did not take away the work, and this is the detail that outsiders find hardest to believe. Antony Armstrong-Jones remained a photographer to the royal family for the rest of his working life. After the separation, after the divorce, after the December remarriage, the commissions kept coming. He photographed the Queen herself for official portraits marking her birthdays and her jubilees. When the Prince of Wales became engaged in 1981 to Lady Diana Spencer, the man brought in to take the engagement portraits, the pictures wired to every front page on the planet, was the prince's former uncle, his aunt's discarded husband. Sit with the strangeness of that. A family famous for holding grudges across generations, a family that never again received Wallace Simpson, that let the Duke of Windsor rot in Paris for 35 years over a single constitutional injury, kept the author of the hate lists on the payroll and inside the frame. The Queen Mother, whose capacity for a frozen enmity was the stuff of palace legend, adored Tony to the end of her life, lunched with him, defended him, treated him for 4 decades as a kind of son who had merely, regrettably, mislaid his marriage. If banishment is the test, this family failed to banish him so completely that the title of this video collapses. But banishment was never the test, and the family that did not banish him is the same family whose entire operating manual forbids the alternative. Follow the logic they lived by, because it explains everything. This institution survives on one asset, the appearance of continuity, and it has one nightmare, the insider turned witness. Every catastrophe of the Queen's reign came from the same species of event, someone who had been inside the walls deciding to talk. Crawfie, the beloved governess, wrote one gentle book in 1950 and was erased from the family's world so completely that her name became their private verb for betrayal. The Duke of Windsor talked, and his memoirs bled the family for years. Diana would talk, through Andrew Morton, and the walls have never fully closed since. Now consider Tony's position in 1978. He had spent 18 years inside those walls. He knew the drinking, the affairs on every side, the finances, the true sequence of the collapse, and he was, by profession, the most media-fluent man ever to hold a place in that family, a man with lifelong friendships in every newsroom in London. Publishers would have emptied vaults for his account, and he never gave it. Not a book, not an interview, not a leak that anyone ever traced. For nearly 40 years after the divorce, on the subject of his marriage, the most connected image maker in Britain said nothing at all, and the family, in turn, kept him warm. You may call that forgiveness if you like. The colder and more accurate word for it is terms. Both sides understood the terms perfectly, and both sides honored them to the grave, and the proof of the arrangement is that it never once needed to be spoken aloud. Which brings us to the woman at the center, and it is time to talk about what forgiveness even means to a person constructed the way Elizabeth II was constructed, because the answer is the key that fits this whole lock. She was formed, before she was formed by anything else, by the abdication, by watching one man's insistence on his private happiness nearly capsize the whole enterprise and put the crown on her stammering father's head and, as her family always believed, put him in his grave at 56. From that formation she drew the rule she applied for 70 years, that the institution eats the personal, always, without exception, beginning with her own. She subordinated her marriage to it, her motherhood to it, by her own children's accounts, her opinions, her tastes, her friendships. A woman who does not permit herself the luxury of acting on her own resentments does not thereby stop having them, she files them. And the people who worked closest to her described, again and again across the decades, the same phenomenon, a memory like a ledger, and a courtesy that never varied with the balance. She was pleasant to prime ministers she distrusted, gracious to presidents who bored her, warm on the telephone to relatives who had wounded her past repair. Her displeasure, when it existed, was expressed in the currency of omission, the invitation that came a day late, the honor that went elsewhere, the conversation that stayed forever on dogs and horses. Tony, of all men, was equipped to read that currency, because it was his mother's currency, the language of the drawing-room ledger, learned below the salt. The two of them understood each other to the end. That is precisely why the surface never cracked, and precisely why you should not mistake the surface for the depths. And on the question of what lay in the depths, the people who wrote the serious books converge from different directions on the same finding. Anne de Courcy, granted the cooperation of Tony himself, records the family's continuing embrace of him while documenting, page after page, conduct that no sister could have watched with equanimity. Sarah Bradford, Margaret's biographer, preserves the notes and the manicurist's sentence and the testimony of a household that lived in the blast radius. Andrew Morton, tracing the sisters' bond in his book on Elizabeth and Margaret, describes a queen for whom Margaret was the one wholly personal attachment of her life, the single relationship that predated the crown and owed it nothing, and describes how the marriage's long public death fell on her, in the phrase of those around her, as a grief she could not show. Craig Brown, assembling his mosaic of Margaret from 99 angles, keeps arriving at the wreckage the marriage left in her, the drinking that worsened, the cruelty that curdled, the decades of aimlessness that followed, and any account of what Tony did must include what Margaret became. Elizabeth watched all of it from the nearest possible distance. She had her sister to Sunday lunch through every year of the decline. She saw the woman who had once lit rooms grow bitter and breakable, saw the operations and the strokes, took the telephone calls, and she was not a stupid woman, and she did not misplace the causes. The proposition of this video is not that the Queen raged. The proposition is narrower and better supported than that. It is that between the 6th of May 1960 and the morning she sat in St. Margaret's Church, there is no record of her ever once, publicly or in any private account that has surfaced, saying a single word in Tony's defense either. The Queen Mother defended him, friends defended him, the obituaries defended him. From the sovereign herself, across 57 years, the record preserves courtesy without one syllable of absolution. In a woman who chose every syllable for 7 decades, you are entitled to find that eloquent. Held beside the family's one other great test case, The strangeness of all this comes into even sharper focus, and the comparison is worth making properly. To measure how strange the family's treatment of Tony really was, put it beside the other case, the control experiment, the man and woman this family did decide to punish, because the comparison is the sharpest instrument we have for reading the Queen's mind. Edward VIII gave up the throne in December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, and the family's response established the house style of unforgiveness for the century. He was exiled in all but name, settled in France on an allowance with conditions. His wife was denied the style of Royal Highness by a decision the family enforced for the rest of her long life, a 3-letter honorific withheld across 4 decades, with a consistency that tells you exactly how personal it was. The couple were excluded from the coronation of 1953, from weddings, from almost everything. When the Duke came to London for family funerals, he came essentially alone, received briefly and coolly, and when he died in 1972, the Duchess was housed for the funeral at Buckingham Palace, with a correctness so glacial that observers described her wandering the corridors like a ghost nobody would acknowledge. That is what this family does when it decides a member has injured the institution. It does not shout, it subtracts, permanently, and lets the subtraction speak. Now run the comparison honestly, charge by charge. Edward's crime was abandoning his duty for love, an act of desertion, selfish beyond argument, but an act whose primary victim was an institution, and whose collateral damage, the shy brother forced onto the throne, the family always counted as its true grievance. He was cruel to no wife. He left lists in nobody's books. Tony's conduct injured actual people, over decades, in ways this video has spent 2 hours documenting, and it also injured the institution, breaching the divorce dam that Edward's crisis had caused the family to build in the first place. If the family's unforgiveness were a moral instrument, Tony should have received the Windsor treatment twice over. He received the opposite. The earldom kept, the commissions kept, the pew at the end. So the instrument is not moral. Look again at the 2 cases and the actual rule surfaces. Edward talked. He published memoirs, gave interviews, sold his grievances to the highest bidder for 35 years, and made himself a permanent external threat with a following. Wallis was punished hardest of all, and Wallis's real offense, in the family's ledger, was being the cause for which the talking was done. Tony injured his wife and never said one public word. Edward injured no wife and never stopped talking. The family destroyed the talker and kept the injurer, and once you see that, you can stop asking whether the Queen forgave Tony, because the question has dissolved into a more accurate one. Forgiveness was never on the menu in either direction. Members are retained or expelled according to the threat they pose from outside the walls, and Tony, who posed none, was retained, and the retention has been mistaken for warmth by 50 years of observers who were watching the wrong hand. And yet, push the institutional reading as far as it will go, and a remainder still will not dissolve, and honesty requires naming it. The Queen was a person as well as an office. The Christmas cards, the sittings, the occasional laughter in the portraits, the front pew, all of it exceeded the minimum that mere containment required. Some of the people who knew her best believed a portion of it was real, that she never stopped being partly fond of the quick, funny man from 1958. Fond of him and unforgiving of him at once, the 2 feelings filed in separate drawers of a mind that had spent a lifetime keeping such drawers from touching. Human beings do this. They love the brother-in-law and hate what he did and carry both to the grave, and the only thing that made the Queen unusual was the discipline with which nothing was ever allowed to spill. If you want a single sentence for what she extended to Antony Armstrong-Jones across 57 years, the nearest true one may be this. She gave him everything except the one thing that could not be performed, and he, of all the men who ever dealt with her, was equipped to know precisely which thing that was, and to understand, every time she smiled at him across a lens, exactly what the smile did and did not contain. No portrait of the family's dealings with Tony is complete without the Queen Mother, because the warmest relationship he ever had inside those walls was with the one member famous for the coldest grudges in the business, and the pairing tells you something about both of them. She took to him from the first, before the wedding, when her own courtiers were still calling him the Jones boy. On paper it made no sense. She was the keeper of the old ways, the woman who had never forgiven Wallace Simpson, who was widely believed to have kept that particular freeze at temperature for 60 years. And here was a bohemian photographer with a past, and she was delighted with him. In practice, it made perfect sense. The Queen Mother's true religion, beneath the ostrich feathers, was charm, performance, the seduction of a room, and Tony was the finest room seducer of his generation. He flirted with her, made her laugh, talked to her about the theatre and the ballet, treated her as a fascinating woman rather than a national monument, the identical treatment that had won her daughter in Chelsea, and it never failed with the mother either, not once, not through the separation, not through the divorce, not through the remarriage. She had him to lunch at Clarence's house for decades after he had ceased to be her son-in-law. She defended him in company. When her own household grumbled that it was disloyal to Margaret, she carried on exactly as before, and Margaret, who noticed everything, noticed. There are two ways to read it, and the truth is probably both at once. The generous reading is that the Queen Mother, who had watched her daughter's temperament at close range for 40 years, privately declined to accept the simple story in which Tony was the villain and Margaret the victim, and there were fair grounds for that, as this video has tried to show. The colder reading is the one Margaret's friends favored, that the Queen Mother's affections had always followed delight rather than justice, that she loved best whoever amused her most, and that her daughter, difficult, demanding, wounded, amused her considerably less than the son-in-law who arrived with theatre gossip and left everyone glowing. Wherever the balance lay, the effect on Margaret was one more brick in the wall of her isolation, the discovery that even her own mother's court had, in some social sense, sided with the man who left the notes. And the effect on the Queen was to make her own position more complicated still, because whatever private accounting the sovereign kept on Tony, she kept it in a family whose matriarch was toasting him at lunch, and a rupture with Tony would have meant a rupture with her mother's table too. The web held every member of that family in place, which is what the web was for. Nobody in it could afford a clean feeling about anybody, least of all about the charming man at the center, spinning. One relationship in this story never got its ending, and since it was the relationship that built the man, it should be followed to its close. Anne, Countess of Ross, the beautiful mother of the seat below the salt, lived to be 90, long enough to watch everything her treatment of her son produced, and the last decades of the two of them are their own quiet chapter. The earldom, as we saw, finally won her delight, and for the years of the marriage Tony possessed at last the thing he had chased since the nursery, a mother proud of him in public. Those who observed them together in the 60s described her presiding at his triumphs, the exhibitions, the palace occasions, with a proprietary glow, as though the son had been her project all along, and described Tony, a grown man at the summit of two worlds, still visibly performing for her, still checking her face across rooms. The divorce cooled the glow, since the loss of a royal daughter-in-law was, in her currency, a demotion, and the relationship settled into the long formality of visits to Nymans, the Messel family's celebrated garden estate in Sussex, where she reigned in widowhood among the magnolias. When she died in 1992, the obituaries celebrated a great hostess and gardener, and her son said in public what sons say. What he actually carried, he put, for once, almost plainly, into the one register he trusted. Interviewers late in his life found that questions about his childhood were received with a charm that closed like a door, and the biography he cooperated with laid out the below-the-salt years in detail he never contradicted, which for a man of his discipline amounts to testimony. He let the record stand. The boy's account of the mother went into the world under his silence, exactly as the world's account of him would, and if he ever noticed the symmetry, he never said. It matters here for one reason. Every serious attempt to understand Antony Armstrong-Jones, including his own biographers, including this one, runs the same explanatory thread from the mother to everything else. From the drawing room ledger to the charm deployed as armament, from the withheld love to the love withheld, and the thread holds. But explanation and excuse are different tools, and the difference is the last discipline this kind of story demands. Plenty of children are ranked and slighted and grow up to break the pattern rather than franchise it. His own wounded leg took him one way, toward the disabled, toward empathy industrialized into good works, proof on the record that he could convert pain into kindness when he chose. The mother wound he converted the other way, into a lifelong license, and the choosing, not the wound, is what the ledger in the palace recorded. The Queen, who read people for a living and had 60 years of data on this one, does not appear ever to have confused the two. Understanding everything is possible. Forgiving is separate work, and it is work the record never shows her doing. From the outside, the 1980s looked like Tony's vindication. He was in his 50s now, silver-haired, still trailing the limp he had never once allowed to be mentioned, and his standing as a photographer had never been higher. The divorce that should have ended his royal access had somehow refreshed it. He shot the official portraits for the Queen's 80th birthday when that milestone eventually came, and long before it, the sittings kept arriving with a regularity that told everyone in his profession exactly where he stood. The Queen at 60, the Queen Mother in her ribbons and pearls, the young Princess of Wales in the honeymoon years when every magazine on earth wanted her face and the palace kept steering the job to Uncle Tony. Diana liked him, by the accounts of those sittings, and the pictures show it. He had the thing no other photographer of royalty ever had, the knowledge of what those rooms felt like from the inside, and his royal portraits carry a strange doubleness because of it, formal and intimate at once, taken by a man who knew precisely which smiles in that family were load-bearing. Beyond the palace work, he was simply, by consensus, one of the best in the world at what he did. His portrait list from these decades reads like the index of the century, writers and dancers and actors and politicians, and his method never changed from the Pimlico days: disarm them, make them laugh, catch the face underneath the face. Colleagues who worked those sessions described a man of endless charm and endless patience with strangers, which sat oddly, and everyone noticed how oddly, beside what the books were beginning to reveal about his patience with the people who loved him. The public man gave no purchase to critics. He worked hard, dressed beautifully, said little, and never, ever, discussed the princess. And there was the other career, the one that even his harshest judges have to salute. His 1974 Working Party on the integration of the disabled had produced a report whose recommendations governments actually adopted, and he kept pushing. He campaigned on access, on housing, on the design of public buildings, at a time when a wheelchair user could not board a London bus or enter half the public buildings in the kingdom, and almost nobody in public life considered that a scandal. He gave his name and his money and, more valuably, his taste and his fury to the cause across 5 decades. The award scheme he founded put disabled students through universities in their thousands, and does so still. When the United Nations declared a year for disabled people in 1981, he was one of the faces of it in Britain, and the disability rights campaigners of that generation, hard people to impress, spoke of him without irony as one of theirs. This was the polio ward paying forward, the 16-year-old alone in Liverpool who had learned what it costs to be looked at as a defect, and it was real, and it was sustained, and no honest account of Antony Armstrong-Jones can leave it out. Plenty of men have been kind in public and cruel at home. Very few have been this kind in public and this cruel at home, and the distance between his two selves is, in the end, the most frightening thing about him, because it means the cruelty was never a failure of empathy. The empathy was fully installed and working. He simply chose, in his private life, whom to spend it on, and his wives were not on the list. If you doubt that, the 1990s supplied the proof, at a terrible price, and it is here that the story leaves Margaret behind and shows you the pattern running on without her, which matters, because it answers the last defense available to him. The defense says Margaret was impossible, and the marriage was a duel of equals, and a different man with a different wife would have been a different husband. Very well, he had a different wife. Lucy, his second, was by every single account the opposite of Margaret in all respects: undemanding, unroyal, devoted, a woman who folded her life around his and asked for nothing but his company. Frances, their daughter, would later write with open love of a mother who had put herself in the shadows and devoted herself to him for 40 years. So observe what he did with a devoted wife and a peaceful home. For roughly 20 of those years, through the second marriage almost from its beginning, He conducted a parallel relationship with a journalist named Anne Hills. She was bright, glamorous, and in love with him, and she kept the secret, and she kept it, and she kept it, waiting through 2 decades of promises implied and deferred. On New Year's Eve of 1996, alone, while the man she loved was elsewhere, Anne Hills took an overdose and was found dead on the roof terrace of her London flat, dressed for a party. The inquest and the newspapers laid the affair bare within weeks. Tony was 66 years old, and a woman had died loving him on the margins of a life that had no margin to give her, and the private grief of that was his own affair. But the public record now held its second dead-ended woman, and the pattern was no longer arguable. It still was not finished. In April of 1998, while still married to Lucy, Tony had a son. The mother was Melanie Cable Alexander, an editor at Country Life some 30 years his junior, and the boy, Jasper, was born when his father was 68. The news reached print, as such news does, and Lucy, who had absorbed everything else, could not absorb a child. The second marriage ended in divorce in 2000. The man was now approaching 70, and the wreckage stood in rows. A daughter conceived on the eve of one wedding and denied for 44 years. A royal marriage dissolved amid documented cruelty. A mistress, dead by her own hand after 20 hidden years. A son born to end a second marriage. And through all of it, the manner never changed. The beautiful suits, the perfect discretion, the wounded charm, the total refusal to explain. His mother's family had raised him to believe that presentation was the whole of the truth. He had spent 70 years proving them right, and everyone near him had paid the bill for the proof. Somewhere in Buckingham Palace, a filing memory 70 years deep took note of every item, said nothing, and sent the Christmas card on time. Margaret, meanwhile, was dying, slowly and in public, and her last decade has to be walked through, because the Queen walked through it beside her, and what the Queen saw in those years is the final exhibit in the case this video is making. The vitality that had survived the divorce did not survive the 80s. The operations began, a piece of lung removed in 1985. The cigarettes only barely surrendered, decades too late. Roddy had married elsewhere in 1981, with her blessing, delivered with a generosity that surprised everyone. And after him, there was no one, not seriously, ever again. The woman who had been the most photographed beauty of the post-war world spent her 60s in a shrinking circle of lunches and memorials, still capable of the old wit and the old cruelty, still pulling rank on hostesses and crushing the unwary, still, her friends insisted, wonderful company on the good days, and increasingly alone on all the others. Then Mystique, the island of the wedding present and the fatal photograph, collected its last payment, a stroke there in 1998. The following year, a bathroom accident on the island, scalding water, her feet burned so badly she never fully walked again. More strokes followed in 2001, taking her sight, then most of the rest. The last photographs of Princess Margaret show her in a wheelchair at her mother's 101st birthday celebration. Dark glasses, swollen, unrecognizable, 71 years old and destroyed. And the country that had spent 25 years punishing her for a swimsuit photograph gasped at what it saw. 6 months later, on the 9th of February 2002, she died in hospital after a final stroke, and her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, 50 years to the day after the funeral of the father she had adored. She had asked to be cremated, the first senior royal in modern times to choose it, so that her ashes could rest with him. Her sister, who wept in public perhaps twice in 70 years, was seen by the congregation to weep. Tony came to the funeral. He was 71 himself now, and the polio was reclaiming the leg it had marked 6 decades earlier. And the photographs of him that day, bowed in the chapel where his wedding had never taken place and his marriage was being buried, moved even the people who knew everything you now know. 7 weeks later, the Queen Mother followed her daughter, and the woman on the throne, in the space of one late winter, lost the only 2 people who had known her before she was anything. And among the mourners at both gatherings, correct, silent, and welcome, stood the man whose marriage had broken one of them. He was not turned away. He was never once turned away. By now you understand why, and you understand what it did and did not mean. And behind those 2 funerals lay a decade that has to be paid its due before the verdict. The 1990s, the years when the bill for 1978 finally came in, because the Queen spent them watching Tony's precedent do to her children what it had first done to her sister, and no account of what she did or did not forgive can leave that decade out. The dam had held for 4 centuries, and then it went in a single generation, and the sequence is worth laying end to end. In 1978, Margaret. In 1992 alone, the year the Queen herself, in the most personal speech of her reign, called her annus horribilis. 3 of her 4 children's marriages failed in public. Anne divorced in the spring. Andrew separated amid photographs of his Duchess and a Texan by a pool that made the Mystique Beach picture look like a parish newsletter, and Charles and Diana's separation was announced from the floor of the House of Commons in December, 3 weeks after Windsor Castle caught fire. The War of the Waleses then ran for 5 years through tell-all books and prime-time confessions, each of which would have been unthinkable, literally outside the thinkable, in the world before 1976, and the Queen signed off on the Charles and Diana divorce herself in 1996, by then almost with relief. Nobody in that palace needed the pattern explained. The first marriage of the television age to fail at the center of the family had established that royal divorce was survivable, that the sky did not fall, that the parties kept their titles and their houses and their places at Christmas, and every subsequent failure walked through the door Margaret and Tony had left open. Constitutional historians will tell you the change was inevitable, that no family could have held the 1950s line through the 1990s, and the historians are almost certainly right. The Queen was not a historian. She was a woman who had made one exception, for her sister, for the man she had personally backed against her own courtiers, and had then stood at the center of the consequences for 20 years while they consumed her children one by one. People in her position do not experience inevitability, they experience sequence, and the sequence began with Tony. And there was a crueler echo inside the decade, one the whole country saw without quite naming it. Diana's war with Charles replayed the Snowdon war beat for beat with the volume turned up, the marriage of the fairy tale wedding curdling in private, the rival affairs, the leaks, the duel of sympathetic photographs, and this time, the palace watched an insider fight the press war with the press's own weapons, as Tony once had, except that Diana fought it against the family rather than merely within it, and won so completely that the institution was brought nearer to real danger than at any time since the abdication. The lesson of 1976 had been learned by the wrong student. Tony had demonstrated, inside the family, for the first time, that the modern media war was winnable by the party who understood cameras, and 16 years later, the family faced a genius of the form armed with that demonstration. When people list what the Queen had to absorb in the 90s, the fire and the divorces and the death in the Paris tunnel and the flag on the empty pole, they rarely trace the methods back to their patent holder. She had watched the original. And to feel the true weight of what the marriage cost the Queen, you have to understand what Margaret was to her, because the sisterhood at the center of this story was unlike any other relationship in either woman's life, and the world persistently misread it. The public version had them as opposites and half-rivals, the dutiful one and the wild one, and the framing was never wrong exactly, but it missed the floor under everything. They were, for the first 10 years, each other's entire world, 2 girls, raised in a sealed enclosure, with 1 governess, 1 pony paddock, and essentially no other children, and the seal was then hardened by the abdication, which taught the whole family that outsiders were dangerous, and blood was the only safe currency. Elizabeth mothered Margaret from the nursery on, worried about her, covered for her, laughed at her jokes as no one else could make her laugh. Margaret, for her part, was the one human being who had known Elizabeth before the crown descended, who called her by the nursery name Lilibet without permission, who could tease the sovereign at her own dinner table and be teased back, and courtiers across 7 decades recorded the same phenomenon with the same faint amazement, that within minutes of Margaret entering a room, the Queen became somebody the rest of them never otherwise met, quicker, sillier, younger, herself. The two spoke on the telephone almost every morning of their adult lives, every morning, for decades. When the calls stopped in 2002, people close to the Queen described the silence of those mornings as one of the deepest subtractions of her old age. Now set the marriage inside that bond, and its full dimensions open up. When Tony charmed his way into the family in 1960, he was not marrying into an institution as Philip had, over the objections of nobody who mattered. He was being handed the person the Queen loved most and could protect least. The sister, whose happiness was the one piece of unfinished business from the worst chapter of the reign, and the Queen, by consenting, by ennobling him, by liking him, had personally underwritten the transaction. Everything he then did to Margaret, the concealments, the notes, the long, cold campaign, he did to the one attachment in the Queen's life that was purely hers, chosen by blood and affection rather than by constitution, and he did it slowly, over 18 years, in an apartment half a mile from the palace, while the Queen received the intelligence in the only way that family transmits intelligence, sideways, in fragments, from her mother, from the household, from Margaret's own morning calls, which by the 70s had become, the accounts agree, a regular bulletin from inside a collapsing building. She was not watching a marriage fail at a distance. She was on the telephone with the casualty every morning for 18 years. Whatever the public knew in 1976, and it knew a beach photograph, the Queen had absorbed the entire war, a day at a time, in her sister's own voice, and had been able to do precisely nothing, because the same constitution that made her the most powerful woman alive gave her no writ inside a marriage, least of all, one she had blessed. There is one more turn in the sisterhood, late and strange and documented, and it belongs in the record because it bears directly on the ledger this video keeps returning to. In the 1990s, with the Queen's own children divorcing in series, the relationship inverted. Margaret, whose catastrophe had come first, was by then the family's only veteran of public marital collapse, and the biographers of those years describe her, for the first time in the sisters' lives, in the role of advisor, the younger counseling the elder through Anne and Andrew and Charles, out of hard-purchased experience, and describe the Queen leaning on her sister in those seasons, to a degree nobody had seen before. The woman Tony had helped break became, in the end, the person who helped the Queen carry the consequences of the breakage's precedent. If you want to know why the Queen's feeling about Antony Armstrong-Jones could never resolve into anything simple, that circle is as close as the record comes to an answer. Every wound in it doubled back. The sister he damaged became the crutch. The precedent he set consumed her children. The children he fathered became her comfort. The pictures he took became her family's memory of itself. Pull any single thread of him out of her life, and half the fabric of it comes away in your hand. And the Queen, who understood fabric better than any monarch in her family's history, never once pulled. The year 2004 deserves its own scene in this chronology, because that is when the wedding day secret finally surfaced, 44 years late, and the manner of its surfacing completed the portrait of everyone involved. Polly Fry was by then a woman in her 40s with children of her own, and the questions had followed her all her life in the way such questions do, half-heard remarks at parties, a face in the mirror that matched the wrong friend of the family, the arithmetic of her birthday against a famous wedding that nobody in her world had ever quite stopped doing. She pursued the truth herself, and the DNA test she obtained gave the answer this video gave you 2 hours ago. The man she had grown up adoring as her father was not her father. Her father was the Earl of Snowdon. She wrote later, in a newspaper piece of considerable bravery, about what the discovery cost her, that learning at 45 that the man she had idolized since childhood was not her father was a hard burden to bear, and about the guilt of uncovering a secret that others had spent lifetimes keeping. Tony's public response ran true to 60 years of form. First came airy denial that any test had happened, then silence, then, in time, an acknowledgement made without ever quite being made. The truth permitted to stand once denying it became more trouble than the truth. His biographer records the whole affair without a word of apology from her subject anywhere in it. Jeremy Fry, the best man who never was, dismissed the story publicly in almost the same season that it was being confirmed privately, loyal to the arrangement to the end, and died the following year with the secret finally out of his keeping. And with the paternity established, the wedding of 1960 stands permanently reframed, which is why this chapter matters beyond the gossip. Every earlier account of the marriage's failure had allowed a version in which two flawed people entered honestly and curdled gradually, and blame could be split like a restaurant bill. The 2004 result closed that version. One party entered the marriage of the century, concealing a child by his best friend's wife, conceived during the engagement, born during the honeymoon, and maintained the concealment through 18 years of accusing his wife of failures of character. Margaret never knew. She died 2 years before the test, which those who loved her have called a mercy, and it is one, though a bitter kind, since it means she also died still inside the accounting the world had done in 1976. The beach photograph on her side of the scale, the airport statement on his, and no correction ever reaching her. The correction reached everyone else. It reached the palace, where the woman who had signed the marriage warrant was 78 years old and had 2 decades of Christmas cards to Tony still ahead of her, every one of them sent on time. There is a final actor in this story, one that arrived half a century late and now shapes how everyone under 50 understands it, and that is television, because for a whole generation, the Snowdon marriage is not history at all. It is a Netflix subplot, and the gap between the drama and the record is worth a moment on its way to the verdict. The Crown gave Tony 2 seasons of magnetic screen time, and the portrait was seductive, cruel, and in its broad strokes closer to the documented record than the family can have enjoyed. The Fry entanglement, the pre-wedding secret, the motorcycle, the taunting, all of it drawn from the biographies you have heard cited tonight, and Tony, then in his last years, is reported by those around him to have been unamused by the whole enterprise, while Margaret's son went on record lamenting the way the series painted his mother. Both objections had merit, because drama compresses, and what the compression cost was the very thing this video has tried to restore, the doubleness. Screen Tony is a beautiful villain. The living man was a villain and a benefactor and a genius and a wound, all 4 at once, all the way down, and Screen Margaret is a tragic wit, when the living woman was also, on her bad days, a tyrant her own staff dreaded and her own biographers struggled to defend. The record is harder than the drama and better than it, and the record was always the point of spending 2.5 hours here rather than 45 minutes there. But the drama did accomplish one thing the record never managed, and it should be acknowledged. It made a new century care. The books this video stands on sold in thousands. The series played to tens of millions, and in its wake, the questions came back to life, the searches, the arguments, the reappraisals of Margaret that finally, decades too late, extended her some of the sympathy the 1970s refused, and some of that sympathy has begun, at last, to be subtracted from her husband's account, which is roughly where this video came in. Public memory is not a court, it is a tide, and tides can be turned by anything, even by streaming television, and the tide on Antony Armstrong-Jones has been turning for a decade now, away from the airport halo, toward the notes in the books, and the turning is why his name can headline a video like this one at all. The Queen, who died with the ledger still in its drawer, would have found the whole spectacle vulgar beyond speech. She would also, one suspects, not have corrected a word of it. One thread has run under this whole story without ever being pulled straight, and it should be, here at the end, because it is the thread that made everything else possible. The camera. It gave Tony his entry, his cover, his fortune, and his afterlife, and the way he used it is the closest thing we have to a map of the man. His portraits worked because of a single method he described often and practiced always. Put the sitter at ease, dissolve the occasion, wait for the face beneath the arrangement. He kept the equipment minimal and the patter constant, told jokes, asked questions, moved furniture, made tea, anything to melt the performance a public person walks in wearing, and then took the picture in the seam between performances. Sitters came out of his studio describing the session as one of the most delightful conversations of their lives, and only later, seeing the print, understood how much he had taken. The gift, in other words, was intimacy on demand, manufactured, deployed, and withdrawn on schedule, and once you name it like that, you can see the whole biography inside the job description. The dinner party in Chelsea in 1958 was a portrait session. So was the courtship of the Queen Mother. So was the airport statement in Sydney. So was every drawing room he ever entered from the age of 5. The boy below the salt learning to read a table full of faces and give each one exactly what would win it. People who met him spoke of feeling singled out, chosen, seen. His wives learned what the sitters never stayed long enough to learn, that being seen by Tony was a service with a session fee, and that when the session ended, it ended. Yet the pictures remain, and they complicate the verdict one last time, because you cannot fake your way to 50 years at the top of that profession. The eye was real, the work ethic was punishing. The archive he left, tens of thousands of images across 6 decades, from the studio portraits to the unflinching documentary work in hospitals and asylums that shamed governments, is a national collection by any measure, held now in national institutions, and it contains, alongside the famous and the royal, a long and honorable record of pointing the lens at exactly the people his world preferred not to see: the old, the ill, the disabled, the poor. The man who could not sustain kindness across a breakfast table sustained it across an entire body of work aimed at strangers. Perhaps that is the fairest last word the craft can offer about him. He was better through glass. Most of us are worse. And the family he married into, which lives and dies by images, received from him, along with all the damage, the finest images it will ever own, which may be the deepest reason of all that the pew at St. Margaret's was filled. Institutions can waive almost anything for the man who holds the negatives. Tony outlived her by 15 years, and the long-last act ran exactly as the whole life had run, in impeccable order over unquiet ground. He kept working past 80, wheeled now into the studio where he had once prowled, arranging sitters from the chair with the same eye and the same charm. He gave at last a handful of late interviews, and even then the discipline held, warmth about the family, wit about the century, and on the marriage a courteous wall. When Anne de Courcy's biography appeared in 2008, written with his cooperation, the man who had guarded everything for 50 years permitted the world to read the Fry paternity, the hate lists reported at second hand, the affairs, the whole terrain, and offered no rebuttal and no apology, as though he had decided that the record could stand so long as he was not the one speaking it. Perhaps he thought it settled accounts. Perhaps, nearer 80 than 70, he simply stopped caring. Either way, the family's manner toward him did not change by 1 degree, which by now you will recognize as the whole grammar of this story. He died at home in Kensington on the 13th of January, 2017, at 86. The burial was private, and it tells you something that after a lifetime spent at the centre of English spectacle, he chose to be buried in Wales, in the small churchyard of St. Baglan's, at Llanfaglan, within sight of the Menai Strait, and a few miles from Caernarfon, the castle where he had staged his masterpiece. The boy seated below the salt went into the ground as a Welsh country gentleman, about as far from his mother's drawing rooms as English earth allows. And then, in April, came the memorial where this story began, St. Margaret's Church in the shadow of the abbey where he had married, 600 mourners, the lovers and the colleagues, and the children of 4 mothers, and in the front pew, 90 years old, the Queen. So finish the accounting with her, because it is her accounting that the title of this video promised, and you now hold every entry in it. On one side, everything he gave, the laughter in the early years, the photographs that made her family human for half a century. Caernarfon, which bought the monarchy a decade of modernity in one afternoon. The silence, 40 years of perfect, purchasable, never purchased silence, worth more to that institution than any service rendered by any courtier of her reign. And the children, David and Sarah, who emerged from the wreckage kind and steady, Sarah in particular becoming, by common consent, the niece the Queen loved best, and one of the few people on earth in whose company she was ever described as completely at ease. Every one of those entries is real, and the Queen honoured every one of them, with the earldom kept, the doors kept open, the commissions kept coming, the front pew filled at the end. And on the other side, her only sister, the one wholly personal love of a wholly institutional life, collected at 29 by a man who was concealing a child, conceived weeks before the wedding, ground down across 18 years by a cruelty that was documented, written, deliberate, and left where she would find it alone. The first divorce at the centre of the family since the 16th century, detonating the principle for which her family had already sacrificed Margaret once, and opening the breach through which her own children's marriages would pour 20 years on. The sister returned to her, at the end of it, reduced, drinking, mocked by the country, and then dying by inches across a decade of strokes and burns, while the man who had started the reduction photographed jubilees. A woman dead on a rooftop on New Year's Eve, a son at 68, 2 wives, one buried secret at a time. The Queen was in possession of all of it, longer and more completely than any biographer, and against all of it she maintained, for 57 years, a courtesy that never thawed into a single recorded word of warmth about his conduct, and never cooled into a single visible act of reproach. That is not forgiveness. Forgiveness cancels a debt. This was something her trade understood better, the permanent carrying of a debt that must never be called in, because calling it in would cost the institution more than the debt is worth. She kept him close for the same reason central banks hold the bonds of governments they do not trust. Letting go is more expensive. There is one image to leave you with, and it is not from the church. It is from the photographs he took of her across the decades. Because they hang in the middle of this story, like a confession neither of them ever made in words. Look at the official portraits sometime, the ones from after the divorce, the Queen at 60, at 70, at 80, by Snowdon. They are warmer than almost any other pictures of her in existence. She is nearly smiling in most of them, and in one or two she is actually laughing. An old woman, amused by an old man she had known since they were young and glittering, and about to make each other's lives so much harder. He could still do it, even then, even after everything, the thing he had done at that first meeting in 1958, the thing he had done to her sister in the Rotherhithe room, make a guarded woman forget the guard. She let him, once a decade, for the length of a shutter. Then the sitting ended, the equipment was packed, the courtesies were exchanged, and the ledger, which no photograph ever touched, went back in its drawer, where it stayed until the morning she carried it into St. Margaret's Church, and out again, and finally, 5 years later, to her own grave, unpaid, unspoken, and never, in the only sense that ever mattered to her, forgiven. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting. There are 2 videos on your screen right now, both from this channel, both going just as deep into the people this family used up and the secrets it managed. And if you have not yet subscribed, this is the moment, because stories like this one take weeks to build, and the subscription is what makes the next one possible. Pick a video, settle in, and we will see you there.